Ma'am, hold on. Where do you think you're going dressed like that? The words cut through the morning air of Meridian International Airport like a blade sharp and dismissive, stopping Captain Vanessa Cole mid-stride in the corridor between gates B12 and B14. She turned slowly, her 4 gold captain stripes catching the fluorescent light, her crew credential hanging visibly around her neck, her flight bag rolling to a halt behind her. The officer blocking her path, platinum blonde hair, cropped military short 6'3" badge gleaming on his chest, looked at her uniform, looked at her dark skin, and in that single glance made a decision that would unravel his entire career in exactly 23 days. What he didn't know, what he couldn't possibly see in that moment, was that the woman standing before him had logged over 16,000 flight hours, had earned every stripe on her shoulders through years of relentless work and unshakable skill, and had already survived a lifetime of moments exactly like this one. She looked at him with steady eyes and said calmly, without a trace of defensiveness, "I'm going to my aircraft, officer. I'm the captain on flight TA-889, departing gate B17 at 7:45. I have 198 passengers boarding in 45 minutes." And in the space between his skepticism and her certainty, everything that followed began to take shape. A detention that would last 31 minutes, a viral video that would be watched by 127 million people, and a reckoning that would change airport security protocols across 47 airports nationwide. But to understand how a single morning could hold that much weight, how one woman's dignity under pressure could shift the foundations of an entire industry, we need to go back to where this story really begins. Long before that corridor, long before that confrontation, back to a 10-year-old girl standing at a chain-link fence outside Detroit, watching a small plane land and feeling something ignite inside her that would never, ever go out. The alarm went off at 4:30 in the morning, though Captain Vanessa Cole had been awake for the better part of an hour already, her mind running through the day's flight plan the way it always did before a big departure, the checklist unspooling in her head like muscle memory worn smooth by years of repetition and discipline. She rose quietly in the darkness of her bedroom, moved through her morning routine with the precision of someone who had done this hundreds of times before, and by 5:15 she was dressed in her full Transatlantic Airways captain's uniform, the navy blue fabric pressed crisp and perfect. The 4 gold stripes on her shoulders, sitting exactly where they belonged, earned through 21 years of flying through every certification exam, and every flight hour logged, and every moment of proving herself in a profession that had never made space for women who looked like her. The drive to Meridian International Airport took 35 minutes in the pre-dawn stillness of Charlotte, North Carolina. The highways mostly empty, except for the occasional semi-truck hauling freight toward the coast, and Vanessa used the time to listen to the recorded weather briefing one more time, her hands steady on the wheel, her thoughts already at 37,000 feet, even though her body was still on the ground. She arrived at the airport at 6:15, a full 90 minutes before her scheduled departure, because this was her ritual and her rhythm, the buffer of time she needed to walk the terminal at her own pace, to grab her coffee without rushing to settle into the mental space required to command an aircraft carrying nearly 200 souls through the sky. The terminal greeted her with its familiar early morning atmosphere, that particular half-awake hum of fluorescent lights and the smell of burnt coffee mixing with industrial cleaner. The sound of gate agents opening their podiums and cleaning crews finishing their overnight shifts. The soft beep of badge scanners, and the distant rumble of jet engines warming up on the tarmac outside. Vanessa badged through the crew entrance with the ease of someone who belonged there completely. Her employee photo ID clipped to her lapel, showing her name and the word "Captain" printed beneath her photograph. Her FAA-issued airman certificate tucked safely in her jacket pocket. The way it always was, her crew credential hanging on a lanyard around her neck with her photo and access clearance visible to anyone who glanced her way for more than a single second. She moved through the terminal with purpose but without hurry, Her flight bag rolling smoothly behind her on well-oiled wheels, her posture straight and her expression calm. The kind of calm that comes from having done something so many times that the external chaos of an airport terminal becomes nothing more than background noise to the quiet certainty of knowing exactly what comes next. At the coffee kiosk near the security checkpoint, she stopped and ordered her usual medium black coffee from Rosa, the Latina barista, who had been working this shift for the past 3 years and who always greeted Vanessa with a warm smile and a genuine good morning that made the early hour feel just a little less brutal. They exchanged a few words about the weather, about Rosa's daughter who was starting community college in the fall, about the way the terminal seemed quieter than usual for a Tuesday. And then Vanessa took her coffee and continued toward the B concourse, her destination clear in her mind. Gate B-17 waiting for her just 3 minutes away, her aircraft already being prepped by the ground crew, her first officer probably already on board running through the pre-flight checklist. Everything was normal. Everything was routine. Everything was exactly as it should be on a morning like any other morning, and Vanessa had no reason to believe that in less than 5 minutes her entire day would be derailed by a man who looked at her uniform and her credentials and her 21 years of experience and decided that none of it could possibly be real. She walked through the wide corridor that connected the main terminal to the B concourse, her coffee warm in her hand. Her mind already shifting into captain mode, already thinking about the flight path and the passenger manifest, and the small technical note the maintenance crew had logged about a minor hydraulic sensor that had been replaced overnight and needed to be verified during pre-flight. The terminal around her was beginning to wake up in earnest. Now more travelers appearing at gates, more announcements crackling over the PA system, more flight crews in various airline uniforms moving through the concourses with the same purposeful efficiency that Vanessa carried in her own stride. She passed Gate B9, then Gate B11, her eyes catching the departure board that showed her flight TA-889 to Atlanta on time boarding at 7:15, and she felt the familiar small surge of focus that came with knowing the countdown had begun, that in 90 minutes she would be responsible for lifting that aircraft off the ground and delivering every single person on board safely to their destination. And then a hand came up in front of her like a stop sign, and a voice that carried no courtesy and no warmth said the words that would change everything that followed. To understand what happened next, to really understand the weight of that moment when Officer Garrett Sullivan stepped into Vanessa Cole's path and questioned whether she belonged there, you have to know who Vanessa was long before she ever put on a captain's uniform. Back when she was just a 10-year-old girl growing up in Detroit, Michigan, the youngest of 3 children in a household where her father worked as an auto mechanic and her mother taught 2nd grade at the neighborhood elementary school. Neither of her parents had ever been on an airplane until Vanessa was 10 years old, and her school organized a field trip to a small regional airfield just outside the city limits, a trip that most of the kids were excited about mainly because it meant missing a full day of regular classes. But for Vanessa, it meant something else entirely. Something that would reshape the entire trajectory of her life in ways she couldn't possibly have understood at the time. While the other kids clustered around the snack table or chased each other across the grass, Vanessa pressed herself against the chain-link fence that bordered the runway and watched with absolute focus as a small Cessna made its final approach, the landing gear dropping with a mechanical precision that made her heart skip the wheels, touching down so smoothly it looked like the plane was being set onto the tarmac by invisible hands. And in that moment, something clicked inside her. Something fundamental and unshakable. A certainty that this was what she was meant to do with her life. Even though she had no framework for understanding how a girl like her could possibly get from a Detroit public school to the cockpit of an airplane, but she held on to that certainty the way you hold on to something precious and fragile, protecting it from the voices that told her it wasn't realistic that girls didn't become pilots, that black girls especially didn't become pilots, that she should focus on more practical dreams and more achievable goals. By the time she was 16, she had read every single book about aviation that the Detroit Public Library system carried had memorized. The names of every commercial aircraft in active service, had studied flight manuals and aerodynamics textbooks and FAA regulations, with the kind of obsessive focus that her teachers noticed but didn't quite know what to do with, and when she told her high school guidance counselor that she wanted to go to flight school, the counselor looked at her with a mixture of pity and confusion and suggested that maybe she should consider nursing. Instead, something more stable, something more within reach for someone in her situation. Vanessa thanked her politely and then went home and applied to Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University anyway, scraping together scholarship applications and financial aid forms and letters of recommendation from teachers who believed in her even when the system didn't, and when the acceptance letter arrived. 6 months later, she cried in her mother's arms, not because she was surprised that she'd gotten in, but because she was so deeply, profoundly grateful that someone somewhere had looked at her application and seen potential instead of impossibility. She put herself through Embry-Riddle on a patchwork combination of academic scholarships, federal grants, part-time work, waiting tables at a diner near campus, and the kind of bone-deep determination that comes from knowing that failure isn't an option, because there's no safety net waiting to catch you if you fall. She graduated with honors at 23 with a degree in aeronautical science and a commercial pilot's license, and then she spent the next 4 years building flight hours the hard way, working as a first officer for a regional carrier that flew short hops between small airports in the southeast, logging every hour and every landing and every challenging weather condition in her logbook like they were currency. She was saving for a future she could already see taking shape. At 28, Transatlantic Airways recruited her based on her record and her flight hours, and the glowing recommendations from every captain she'd ever flown with, and she accepted the position, knowing that she was walking into an industry that still looked at her with surprise. Every single time she introduced herself as a pilot that still made passengers do double takes when they saw her in uniform that still carried the weight of assumptions and stereotypes she would have to navigate for the rest of her career. She made captain at 36 years old, one of the youngest captains in Transatlantic's history at the time, and by the morning she walked into Meridian International Airport at 6:15 a.m. on that Tuesday in March. She had logged over 16,000 flight hours, had flown across the Atlantic Ocean more times than she could count, had landed in near-zero visibility conditions that would have terrified less experienced pilots, had handled an engine anomaly over the Gulf of Mexico with a full cabin of passengers, and brought everyone home without so much as a scratch on the aircraft. Her safety record was absolutely spotless. Her crew evaluations consistently used words like unflappable and commanding and exceptional. She had been named to the airline's internal safety review panel 3 times. And she had never, not once in 21 years of professional flying, given anyone a legitimate reason to question her competence or her authority. But she had also learned through years of experience that had worn grooves into her understanding of how the world worked, that credentials and skill and an impeccable record were sometimes not enough to overcome the single most damaging assumption people made when they looked at her, which was that a black woman in a captain's uniform must be wearing someone else's clothes, must be playing dress-up, must be anything other than exactly what she claimed to be. And beyond all of that professional achievement, beyond the flight hours, and the certifications, and the spotless record, Vanessa was also a mentor. Someone who had spent the last 9 years volunteering with a non-profit organization called Wings of Hope that worked to introduce young black girls to careers in aviation. Someone who had personally guided 18 young women through the process of earning their pilot's licenses. Someone who gave out her personal cell phone number to girls who called her at 10 o'clock at night with questions about flight school applications and scholarship deadlines, and whether they really belonged in a profession that seemed designed to exclude them. She showed up to career fairs in her full captain's uniform, not because Transatlantic asked her to, but because she remembered what it felt like to be 10 years old at that fence, watching a plane land and feeling something ignite inside her, and she wanted every single girl who felt that same pull to know that the cockpit was available to them, that they had every right to be there, that their dreams were valid and achievable and worth fighting for no matter how many people told them otherwise. That was who Officer Garrett Sullivan stopped in the corridor of Meridian International Airport on that Tuesday morning. Not just a captain, not just a pilot with 16,000 hours and a perfect record, but a woman who had spent her entire life proving that she belonged in spaces that had never been designed to include her, and who was about to face that battle one more time in a way that would be captured on camera and witnessed by millions of people around the world. Vanessa stopped walking the moment Officer Sullivan's hand came up in front of her. Not because she was startled or intimidated, but because she had learned through years of navigating these kinds of encounters that cooperation was always the safer choice, that resistance could be used against you. No matter how justified it might be, that the smart play was to stay calm and let the situation unfold and trust that the truth would eventually win out, even if it took longer than it should. She looked at the officer blocking her path and took in everything about him in the space of a single breath. The platinum blonde hair cropped short and neat. The 6'3" frame that he carried with the particular confidence of someone who had never been told no in any situation that mattered. The airport police badge gleaming on his chest. The way his eyes moved across her uniform with open skepticism rather than recognition, scanning her 4 gold stripes and her crew credential and her employee ID, as though he was looking at a costume instead of the real thing. His tone when he spoke carried no courtesy, no warmth, just a flat dismissiveness that made it clear he had already decided she didn't belong here, and everything that followed would simply be the process of confirming what he already believed. "Ma'am, hold on." He set his hand still up like a barrier between her and the rest of the concourse, his voice carrying the kind of authority that expected immediate compliance. "Where do you think you're going dressed like that?" The question hung in the air between them, loaded with implication, and Vanessa felt the familiar tightening in her chest that came with moments like this, that suffocating awareness that everything she had earned, and everything she had built, and everything she was could be reduced in a single instant to nothing more than suspicion and doubt. She had been in this moment before, not in this airport, and not with this particular man, but in this exact emotional space. This place where someone looked at her credentials and her uniform and her years of experience and decided that none of it could possibly be legitimate because it didn't match the picture they carried in their heads of what a captain was supposed to look like. She didn't sigh, didn't roll her eyes, didn't let even a single degree of heat enter her voice because she knew from hard-won experience that any display of emotion would be used against her would be interpreted as attitude or aggression or evidence that she was exactly the kind of person who didn't belong in a professional environment. "I'm going to my aircraft, officer," she said, her voice calm and clear and carrying the kind of professional precision that had become second nature to her after 2 decades in cockpits. "I'm the captain on flight TA-889, departing gate B-17 at 7:45. I have 198 passengers boarding in 45 minutes. Officer Sullivan, whose name she would learn later, along with far more about him than she ever wanted to know, looked at her with an expression that managed to combine doubt and dismissiveness in equal measure. His eyes moving from her face to her uniform and back again, as though he was waiting for the costume to somehow give itself away. He looked at the 4 gold stripes on her shoulders, the universal symbol of a commercial airline captain that any airport security officer should have recognized immediately, and then he looked back at her face and said in a tone that made it clear he wasn't asking so much as demanding, "Can I see some ID?" Vanessa reached into her jacket pocket with movements that were deliberate and slow and designed to communicate complete cooperation. And she pulled out 2 documents that should have ended this encounter immediately: her FAA Airman Certificate, a federally issued credential with her name and certificate number, and all of her ratings printed clearly on official government paper, and her Transatlantic Airways employee photo ID with her face and her name and the word captain printed in bold letters beneath her photograph. She held both documents out to Officer Sullivan without saying a word because at this point there was nothing she could say that would carry more weight than the credentials themselves. Nothing that would make him see what he should have already seen the moment he looked at her uniform. Sullivan took the documents from her hand and examined them with an exaggerated thoroughness that felt deliberately insulting, holding them up to the light and squinting at them and turning them over as though he was looking for watermarks or security features that might indicate forgery, taking far longer than any reasonable verification should have required, making a show of his skepticism in a way that made it clear this wasn't about security protocol, but about something else entirely, something deeper and uglier that he probably wouldn't have been able to name even if someone had asked him directly. The seconds stretched out into what felt like minutes, and Vanessa stood there with her coffee in one hand and her flight bag handle in the other, maintaining her professional composure while something burned quietly in her chest. The accumulated weight of every time someone had questioned whether she belonged, every time someone had looked at her credentials and decided they couldn't possibly be real, every time she had been forced to prove something that should never have been in question in the first place. Finally, Sullivan looked up from the documents and said in a tone that carried no apology and no acknowledgement of how absurd this entire interaction had become. "These don't look right to me." The words landed like a slap, and for just a moment Vanessa felt the full weight of the impossibility she was facing, because what do you say to someone who is holding your valid federal aviation credentials in their hands and telling you that those credentials don't look right? What argument can you possibly make that will penetrate that kind of willful blindness? What proof can you offer beyond the proof you've already given? But she had spent 21 years learning how to navigate moments exactly like this one, learning how to stay calm when everything inside her wanted to scream, learning how to speak in the careful, measured tones that might get through to someone who had already decided not to listen, and so she took a breath and said with absolute precision, "Both documents are valid and current. My FAA certificate number is registered in the FAA Airman Inquiry database, which you can access from any computer or mobile device. My employee ID is verifiable with one phone call to Transatlantic Airways Operations Center. I would recommend you make that call now, because my departure window is not flexible and I have passengers counting on me to get them to Atlanta on time." Officer Sullivan handed the IDs back to her, but he did not step aside, did not acknowledge that she had just provided him with two separate ways to verify her identity and credentials. In under 60 seconds, did not show any indication that he understood or cared that he was currently delaying a commercial flight for no legitimate reason whatsoever. Instead, he pointed toward a side corridor near Gate B13, a narrow space away from the main flow of the terminal, away from the gate agents and the passengers and anyone who might witness what happened next, and he said in a voice that expected obedience, "I'm going to need you to come with me." Vanessa looked at where he was pointing, looked back at his face, and felt the situation crystallizing into something she couldn't ignore or deflect or navigate around, felt the moment arriving when she would have to make a choice about how to respond to this obvious overreach of authority. This clear violation of every protocol that should have governed how airport security interacted with credentialed airline crew. She could refuse, could stand her ground right here in the main concourse, could demand to speak to a supervisor or call her airline's legal department, or make this into the public confrontation that it was already threatening to become. Or she could cooperate, could go with him to that side corridor, could trust that the truth would eventually win out, and that documentation and witnesses and the sheer absurdity of what was happening would ultimately work in her favor. "Officer," she said, keeping her voice level and professional, even as her heart rate kicked up in her chest. "I want to cooperate with you fully, but I need you to state the specific reason you're detaining me. And I need you to contact my airline's operations center immediately. My co-pilot and my crew are already at the aircraft. If I am not at that gate in the next 40 minutes, this flight does not depart on time, and 198 passengers will be delayed because of this stop." "I'm not going to ask you again," Sullivan said. And there was something in his tone now, something harder and less patient. The sound of someone who was used to being obeyed and who didn't appreciate having his authority questioned by anyone, let alone by someone he had already decided didn't belong. Vanessa looked at him for one more long moment, and then she said quietly, "You haven't asked me once, officer. You've only issued demands without cause. But I'll come with you, and I want everything that happens in the next few minutes on record." She walked with him toward the side corridor, her coffee still warm in her hand, her flight bag rolling behind her, her mind already cataloging every detail of this encounter in the same systematic way she cataloged pre-flight checklists and weather anomalies, and every other piece of information that might become critical later. She didn't resist, didn't argue further in the open terminal because she understood in a way that came from years of hard-won experience that the corridor of an airport was not where she would win this fight. Composure would win this. Documentation would win this. The truth eventually would win this. She just had to stay steady and calm and professional long enough to let it. What Officer Garrett Sullivan didn't know as he escorted Captain Vanessa Cole toward that side corridor near Gate B, 13. What he couldn't possibly have anticipated because he was operating from a place of such absolute certainty that he had already decided how this situation would resolve itself, was that 3 people had witnessed the stop and were already setting into motion a series of responses that would ensure this encounter didn't simply disappear into the background noise of a busy airport morning. The first witness was Maya Rodriguez, a 28-year-old gate agent working at Gate B16, just 2 gates down from where Vanessa's flight was scheduled to depart, and Maya had been watching the entire interaction unfold from her position behind the check-in podium. Had seen the officer step into the captain's path and had immediately recognized that something was wrong because she knew Captain Cole had chatted with her dozens of times over the past year, whenever Vanessa's flights departed from Maya's gates, had always found her to be friendly and professional, and exactly the kind of person who would never give an airport security officer any legitimate reason to stop her. Maya watched as the officer examined Vanessa's credentials with that exaggerated skepticism, watched as he pointed toward the side corridor. Watched as Vanessa walked with him away from the main flow of the terminal and the moment they disappeared from view. Maya picked up the phone at her podium and called the Transatlantic Airways Ground Operations Center. Her voice tight with concern as she explained to the supervisor on duty that Captain Cole had been stopped by airport police and hadn't made it to her aircraft yet, and something about the whole situation felt deeply wrong, in a way that Maya couldn't quite articulate, but knew in her gut needed immediate attention. The supervisor, a woman named Janet Reeves, who had been with Transatlantic for 23 years and knew Captain Cole's record as well as anyone in the company, listened to Maya's report with growing alarm and immediately grabbed her radio and said 4 words that would set everything else in motion. "Find her right now." The second witness was a 9-year-old girl named Zoe Bennett, who was sitting at Gate B15 with her grandmother Patricia, a 67-year-old retired school teacher who had raised 3 children and 7 grandchildren, and who had developed over the years a finely tuned radar for injustice in all its forms, large and small, obvious and subtle. Zoe had been watching the terminal with the unfocused curiosity of a child who finds airports endlessly fascinating, tracking the movement of pilots and flight attendants and passengers with their rolling suitcases, and she had noticed the woman in the captain's uniform walking through the concourse had pointed her out to her grandmother and said in the way that children do when they're excited about something, "Nana, look, there's a pilot, she has the fancy stripes and everything," and Patricia had looked up and smiled and said, "Yes, baby, she's a captain. Those 4 stripes mean she's in charge of the whole airplane." But then Zoe had watched as the police officer stepped into the captain's path, had seen the way he held up his hand like he was stopping someone who didn't belong there, had watched the captain produce her credentials, and had seen the officer examine them with that deliberate slowness that even a 9-year-old could recognize as disrespectful. And Zoe had tugged on her grandmother's sleeve and asked in a voice that was genuinely confused, "Nana, why is that policeman being mean to the pilot? She has the uniform. She has the badge thing around her neck. Did she do something bad? Patricia Bennett had looked up from her book at that question, had followed her granddaughter's gaze to where the officer and the captain were standing in the corridor, and she had felt something cold and familiar settle into her chest. That particular kind of anger that comes from recognizing a pattern you've seen too many times before, a pattern that you desperately wish your grandchildren would never have to learn, but that you know you can't protect them from forever. "No, baby," Patricia had said quietly, her eyes still on the scene unfolding through the terminal glass. She didn't do anything wrong. Then why won't they let her go fly the plane? Zoe had asked, her voice rising with the kind of indignation that children feel when they encounter something that violates their sense of fairness. She has the uniform. It has the stripes and everything. My teacher says pilots are heroes because they keep people safe. Why is that policeman stopping a hero? Patricia hadn't answered immediately because she was pulling her phone out of her purse, her hands moving with the practiced efficiency of someone who had learned over the years that documentation mattered, that witnesses mattered, that sometimes the only way to make people see what was happening right in front of them was to capture it on camera and force them to look at it again later when they couldn't hide behind excuses or rationalizations. She opened her phone's camera app and started recording, holding it discreetly but steadily, capturing the image of Captain Vanessa Cole standing in that corridor in her full uniform with her credentials visible while two police officers questioned her right to be there. And she kept recording because she knew, even if Zoe didn't yet understand that this moment mattered, that this was the kind of thing that people needed to see. Sometimes baby Patricia finally said, her voice quiet and measured in the way she used when she was trying to explain something painful to a child who deserved better than lies. Sometimes people don't see what's right in front of them. They see what they expect to see instead of what's real. But that doesn't make sense. Zoe had protested, her face scrunched up in confusion. She's wearing the captain uniform. It has the stripes and the wings and everything. How can he not see that Patricia had tightened her grip on her phone, making sure the recording captured everything clearly, and she had said something that she knew would shape how her granddaughter understood the world for years to come? Is it because she's black? Like us? Nana Zoe had asked the question, coming out small and uncertain, and Patricia had wanted more than anything to tell her granddaughter that no, that wasn't it. That skin color didn't matter, that people were judged solely on their qualifications and their character and their credentials. But Patricia Bennett had lived 67 years in America, and she had learned long ago that lying to children about these things didn't protect them. It just left them unprepared for the reality they would inevitably face. Sometimes, baby, she had said the word catching in her throat. Sometimes that's exactly why. The third witness was First Officer David Callahan, Vanessa's co-pilot, a 32-year-old white man who had been flying with Captain Cole for the past 3 years, and who had come to respect her not just as a pilot, but as one of the best captains in the entire transatlantic fleet. Someone whose calm competence under pressure had taught him more about professional flying than any textbook ever could. David had arrived at the aircraft 15 minutes before Vanessa had already completed the preliminary walk-around inspection and had started working through the cockpit pre-flight checklist, and he had been expecting his captain to arrive at any moment because Vanessa was never late, was in fact usually one of the first people to arrive at the aircraft because she liked having that extra time to review everything without rushing to make sure that every single item on the checklist was completed thoroughly and correctly before they even thought about pushing back from the gate. But 8 minutes passed with no sign of Captain Cole, and David checked his watch and felt the first small stirring of concern, because this wasn't like her, this deviation from her normal routine. He pulled out his phone and called her cell, but it went straight to voicemail, and that stirring of concern grew into something sharper and more urgent because Vanessa always answered her phone when she was on duty, always kept it on and within reach in case the airline needed to contact her for any reason. David called the operations desk and asked if Captain Cole had checked in yet, and the operations specialist on duty checked the badge entry logs and said, "Yeah, She badged through the crew entrance at 6:15, so she should be at the aircraft by now. That information, which should have been reassuring, instead made David's concern spike into something closer to alarm, because if Vanessa had badged in over 30 minutes ago and still hadn't made it to the aircraft, something was wrong. He immediately called Maya Rodriguez at the gate and asked if she had seen Captain Cole, and Maya's voice, when she answered, was tight with tension as she said, "Officer Sullivan stopped her. They went to the side corridor near B13. I already called ops." David felt his jaw tighten, because he knew Sullivan's reputation, had heard other crew members talk about him in the crew lounge, had heard stories about stops that lasted too long, and questions that crossed the line from security protocol into something else entirely. And he knew, without needing to be told exactly what was happening in that corridor right now, knew that his captain was being detained for no reason other than the fact that Officer Garrett Sullivan had looked at her and decided she didn't belong. "Get the supervisor?" David said, his voice carrying an edge that would have surprised anyone who knew him as the easygoing first officer who never made waves. "Get Janet Reeves down there right now." The side corridor near Gate B13 was a utilitarian space that passengers rarely noticed, a narrow passage that led to crew rest areas and maintenance access points and storage closets. Fluorescent lights humming overhead in that particular frequency that lives somewhere between a headache and white noise. The sound of the terminal muffled here, distant like listening to a conversation happening in another room. Officer Garrett Sullivan had chosen this location deliberately because it was away from the main flow of foot traffic, away from the passengers who might have questioned what they were seeing, away from anyone who might have witnessed this encounter and recognized it for what it was, which was not a legitimate security stop, but rather a man exercising authority he didn't actually have over someone he had decided didn't belong in the uniform she was wearing. He pulled his radio from his belt and keyed the mic, his voice carrying into the dispatch channel that connected every airport police officer on duty that morning, and what he said into that radio would later be pulled from the official logs and typed into internal affairs reports and quoted in news articles and analyzed by attorneys and played back in oversight hearings. But in this moment he spoke with the casual confidence of someone who had never been seriously challenged in his professional life and who had no reason to believe this morning would be any different. "Dispatch. This is Sullivan," he said into the radio, his body camera recording everything, though he seemed to have forgotten it was there, or simply didn't care because he was so certain he was in the right. "I have detained an individual in the B concourse who is claiming to be an airline captain, possibly impersonating airline personnel, requesting verification." The word impersonating crackled through the radio and hung in the air between them like something toxic, and Vanessa heard it and felt something crack inside her chest, felt the full weight of the absurdity and the injustice of what was happening settle onto her shoulders like a physical thing. She closed her eyes for exactly 1 second, just 1 second, to steady herself and push down the surge of anger and frustration and bone-deep exhaustion that came from having to fight this same battle over and over again. And then she opened her eyes and looked at Officer Sullivan with an expression that was professionally neutral, but that carried behind it 21 years of dealing with people who refused to see what was right in front of them. "Officer Sullivan," she said, her voice calm and clear, and carrying the kind of precision that came from years of speaking into cockpit radios and addressing passengers over intercom systems. "I need you to understand something. I am not impersonating anyone. I am Captain Vanessa Cole, employee number T, A, 06283, 21-year commercial aviation professional, and the legally designated pilot in command of Transatlantic Flight TA 889. You currently have me detained in a corridor while my passengers are preparing to board. If this flight delays because of this stop, there will be a formal record of exactly why that delay occurred, and that record will include your name and badge number and every single action you took this morning." Sullivan crossed his arms across his chest in a posture that managed to be both defensive and dismissive, at the same time his expression suggesting that her words had landed somewhere around him without actually penetrating. and he said in a tone that was meant to sound reassuring but came across as condescending. "We'll get this sorted out, ma'am. Just stay here while I verify your credentials." Before Vanessa could respond, a second officer appeared at the entrance to the corridor, and Vanessa felt a small flicker of something that might have been hope because the new officer was a black woman. Officer Keisha Williams, according to her name tag, 29 years old with 5 years of airport police experience, and Williams looked immediately uncomfortable with what she was seeing, her eyes moving from Vanessa's 4 gold stripes to her crew credential to her colleague, with an expression that clearly said she thought this stop was a mistake. Williams stepped slightly to the side and spoke quietly to Sullivan, and because both officers seemed to have forgotten or dismissed the fact that Sullivan's body camera was recording every word they said, their conversation was captured with perfect clarity, preserved forever in the archive that would later become evidence in multiple investigations. Garrett Williams said, her voice low but carrying an edge of concern that was hard to miss. "She's got 4 stripes. That's a captain's uniform. Those credentials around her neck are real crew access badges. Why are we stopping her?" "Let's just verify it," Sullivan said, matching her quiet tone, but with an undercurrent of stubbornness that made it clear he wasn't going to back down just because a colleague was questioning his judgment. "Then call operations right now." Williams pressed, and there was something almost pleading in her voice, a recognition that this situation was already problematic and was about to get significantly worse if they didn't resolve it immediately. "One phone call and we can verify everything in 30 seconds. There was a pause, a moment when Sullivan could have made the call and ended this entire encounter, could have verified Vanessa's credentials and stepped aside and allowed her to go to her aircraft and do her job. But instead he said nothing, made no move toward his phone or his radio. Simply stood there with his arms crossed while the seconds ticked by and Vanessa's departure window grew smaller and smaller. Vanessa stood straight with her hands clasped in front of her, her flight bag at her feet, her coffee growing cold in her hand, and she maintained her professional composure because she had to, because she understood with the kind of clarity that comes from lived experience that any display of frustration or anger would be used against her, would be interpreted as evidence that she was exactly the kind of person who didn't belong in a professional environment, would give Sullivan the excuse he was probably looking for to escalate this situation even further. But inside, beneath that carefully maintained exterior, her heart was hammering against her ribs, and her mind was racing through calculations and contingencies, thinking about her passengers waiting at the gate, thinking about David in the cockpit, probably wondering where she was thinking about the flight schedule and the connecting flights that would be affected if they delayed and the domino effect of consequences that would ripple out from this single unnecessary stop. She had been trained for engine failures and emergency descents and every kind of mechanical crisis that could occur at 37,000 feet, had practiced scenarios in simulators, until her responses became muscle memory, had prepared herself for every possible aviation emergency that existed in the training manuals. But nobody had trained her for this, for standing in a corridor in full uniform with valid credentials while a man with a badge questioned her fundamental right to exist in her professional skin. And there was no checklist for this kind of emergency, no procedure to follow except to stay calm and stay professional and trust that eventually somehow the truth would matter more than his assumptions. Through the glass partition that separated the side corridor from the main terminal, Zoe Bennett pressed her face against the transparent surface and watched with growing confusion as the scene continued to unfold in front of her. Her 9-year-old mind struggling to make sense of what she was seeing, because every piece of information she had been taught about how the world worked seemed to be contradicted by what was happening to the captain in the corridor. The woman had the uniform, had the stripes, had the badge around her neck that Zoe's grandmother had explained was the special credential that let pilots go onto airplanes. And yet the police officers were treating her like she had done something wrong, like she was someone who needed to be questioned and detained, and kept away from the gates where the airplanes were waiting. Zoe tugged on her grandmother's sleeve and asked in a voice that carried both confusion and the particular moral certainty that children have before the world teaches them to doubt their instincts. "Nana, I don't understand. She has the uniform. She has the badge thing around her neck. My teacher says pilots are heroes because they keep people safe in the sky. Why is that policeman being mean to her? What did she do wrong?" Patricia Bennett kept her phone steady, kept recording, and she took a breath before answering, because she knew that what she said in this moment would shape how her granddaughter understood fairness and justice and the gap between what should be and what actually is. And she wanted to be careful with her words, wanted to be honest without crushing the idealism that let Zoe look at an injustice and immediately recognize it as wrong. "Baby," Patricia said quietly, her voice carrying the measured cadence of someone who had given this explanation too many times before, to too many children who deserved better. "Sometimes people don't see what's right in front of them. They see what they expect to see instead of what's real." "But that doesn't make sense," Zoe protested, her voice rising with frustration because she was 9 years old and the world was supposed to make sense, was supposed to follow rules that were fair and logical and consistent. "She's wearing the captain uniform. It has the stripes and the wings and everything. It's the exact same uniform as that other pilot we saw earlier. How can he not see that Patricia wanted to tell her granddaughter that the officer could see it, that he was looking right at Vanessa's uniform and her credentials and her professional bearing, and seeing all of it perfectly clearly, but that seeing something and acknowledging something were two entirely different things? That sometimes people's expectations were so strong that they overrode evidence and logic and common sense, that bias worked like a filter that let people look directly at the truth and still convince themselves they were seeing something else entirely." But 9-year-old Zoe had asked a more fundamental question, one that cut through all the complex explanations and reached the heart of what was actually happening in that corridor. And she asked it in a voice that was so small and uncertain that it made Patricia's heart ache with the weight of having to confirm what her granddaughter already suspected. "Is it because she's black, like us, Nana?" The question hung in the air between them, innocent and devastating in equal measure, and Patricia felt the familiar weight of having to explain racism to a child who should have been allowed to believe for a few more years that competence and credentials and doing everything right would be enough to protect you from people's assumptions. She looked at her granddaughter's face, saw the dawning understanding there, saw the way Zoe was putting together pieces that would reshape how she saw the world from this moment forward. And Patricia knew she couldn't lie, couldn't soften this truth into something more palatable, because Zoe would face this same dynamic herself one day, and she needed to understand it, needed to recognize it, needed to know that it wasn't her fault, and it wasn't her failure, but rather a flaw in how some people saw the world. Sometimes baby Patricia said the word catching in her throat. Sometimes that's exactly why. Some people look at a black woman in a captain's uniform and they can't make it fit with what they think a captain should be, so instead of changing what they think, they decide the woman must be wrong, somehow must be pretending, must not really belong there no matter what her credentials say. Zoe fell quiet for a long moment, her eyes still fixed on the scene through the glass, watching as the captain stood straight and dignified while the officers continued to question her, and something shifted in her young face. Something hardening and crystallizing into a determination that Patricia recognized because she had felt it herself 50-some years ago when she first understood how the world really worked. "That's not fair," Zoe said finally, her voice carrying an edge that was new, a sharpness born from having her assumptions about justice challenged and found wanting. "No, baby," Patricia agreed. Still recording, still documenting, still bearing witness to this moment that would matter more than either of them could know yet. "It's not fair at all. When I grow up, Zoe said, her jaw set in a way that reminded Patricia of herself at that age, determined and fierce and unwilling to accept the limitations that other people tried to place on her. I'm going to be a pilot, just like her, and I'm going to make sure everybody knows I belong there. Patricia looked at her granddaughter and felt something break and rebuild simultaneously in her chest. Felt grief for the innocence Zoe was losing mixed with fierce pride at the strength she was already showing, and she squeezed Zoe's hand and said with absolute conviction, "Yes, you will, baby. Yes, you absolutely will." While Officer Garrett Sullivan stood in that side corridor convinced he was conducting a legitimate security verification, while Vanessa Cole maintained her professional composure despite every instinct screaming at her that this stop was wrong and illegal, and fueled by something that had nothing to do with safety or protocol, 3 separate chains of action were already in motion. 3 parallel responses that would converge in the next few minutes and bring this encounter to its inevitable conclusion. The first chain had been initiated by Maya Rodriguez's phone call to the Transatlantic Airways Ground Operations Center, and it was now being driven forward by Janet Reeves, the ground operations supervisor who had 52 years of life experience and 23 years with the airline and absolutely zero patience for nonsense that interfered with her flights getting out on time. Janet had been working in the operations center when Maya's call came in, and she had listened to the gate agent's breathless explanation with growing alarm. Because she knew Captain Vanessa Cole personally had worked with her on dozens of flights over the years, had never once seen her be anything other than completely professional and thoroughly prepared, and the idea that airport police had stopped her and were currently detaining her in a corridor somewhere made no sense unless something had gone very, very wrong. Janet grabbed her radio the moment Maya finished talking and keyed the mic with enough force that her finger turned white at the knuckle, and she said into the radio in a voice that carried the accumulated authority of 2 decades managing ground operations at one of the busiest airports in the Southeast, all transatlantic personnel. "I need eyes on Captain Vanessa Cole immediately. She was stopped by airport police somewhere in the B concourse and has not made it to her aircraft. Find her right now." The urgency in her voice cut through the normal chatter on the operations channel, and within seconds, gate agents and ground crew members and operations staff throughout the B concourse were scanning their areas, looking for a captain in uniform who should have been at her aircraft but was somewhere else, instead detained for reasons that no one could yet explain. Janet didn't wait for responses to come back over the radio because she was already moving, already grabbing her airport operations credential and her phone and heading toward the concourse herself, already pulling up the contact information for Thomas Wright, the airport operations manager who had 30 years of experience and who would need to know immediately that one of their airline captains was being detained without apparent cause. The second chain of action was happening at Gate B-17, where First Officer David Callahan had finished his conversation with Maya Rodriguez and was now standing in the cockpit doorway of the aircraft, his phone pressed to his ear as he called Janet Reeves directly, his voice tight with a combination of concern and barely controlled anger. "Janet, it's David Callahan. Maya says Captain Cole was stopped by Sullivan. That's Officer Garrett Sullivan from Airport Police. He's got a reputation, Janet. Other crew members have complained about him before. He stops people for no reason, and he takes forever to let them go." Janet, who was already striding through the terminal toward the B concourse, felt her jaw tighten at this information because she knew exactly what David was telling her without having to spell it out. Explicitly knew that when a crew member said an officer had a reputation and stopped people for no reason, there was usually a very specific pattern behind those words. A pattern that had to do with who got stopped and who got waved through and what assumptions were being made based on factors that had nothing to do with security. "I'm heading there now," Janet said into her phone, her voice clipped and professional but carrying an undercurrent of anger that was only barely contained. "I've already called Thomas Wright. We're going to get her out of there." The third chain of action was the quietest but potentially the most consequential, and it was happening through the glass partition of the terminal where Patricia Bennett continued to record every second of Vanessa's detention on her phone, her hands steady despite the anger burning in her chest, capturing clear footage of a captain in full uniform with visible credentials being questioned and detained, while passengers and crew members walked freely past in the background. Patricia had lived through enough of these moments to know that documentation mattered, that sometimes the only way to make people see what was happening right in front of them was to capture it on camera and force them to look at it again later when they couldn't hide behind excuses about miscommunication or misunderstanding or innocent mistakes. She kept recording and she kept the frame steady, and she made sure that Vanessa's 4 gold stripes were clearly visible in the shot, made sure that her crew credential was in frame, made sure that the officer's body language and positioning told the story of a professional being detained rather than consulted, and she knew without needing to be told that this footage would matter, that it would become evidence and testimony and truth in a way that spoken words alone could never be. 18 minutes had passed since Officer Sullivan first stopped Captain Vanessa Cole in the corridor. 18 minutes that felt like hours to Vanessa as she stood there maintaining her composure, while her departure window grew smaller and smaller, while her passengers waited at the gate, wondering why their flight wasn't boarding yet, while her co-pilot ran through contingency plans, and her crew wondered where their captain had gone. She checked her watch, not frantically, not with panic, but with the deliberate precision of someone who was calculating exactly how much time was being wasted, and what the consequences of that waste would be. And she spoke again to Officer Sullivan in a voice that was still calm, but that now carried an edge of steel that hadn't been there before, the sound of someone who had reached the limit of her patience with a situation that should never have been happening in the first place. "Officer Sullivan," she said each word precisely, "articulated my departure window is now compromised. I need you to either release me immediately or formally charge me with something. If you're charging me with a crime, I want it stated clearly and on record exactly what that charge is and what evidence you have to support it. If you're not charging me, then you have no legal authority to continue detaining me, and I am within my rights to leave." Sullivan's face hardened at being directly challenged, at having his authority questioned by someone he had already decided didn't have the right to question anything he did, and he said in a tone that carried warning and threat in equal measure, "I don't like your tone, ma'am. And I don't like being illegally detained without cause while my passengers wait and my flight gets delayed." Vanessa shot back, and there it was, finally the first crack in her carefully maintained professional composure, the first indication that beneath all that calm there was a human being who was tired and frustrated and angry at having to fight this same battle over and over again. But one of those things is a professional inconvenience, officer, and the other is a violation of my civil rights. Would you like to guess which is which? Officer Williams, who had been standing off to the side, looking increasingly uncomfortable with everything that was happening, took a step closer to her colleague and said in a voice that was low but urgent, "Garrett, I really think you need to call operations right now. This has gone on long enough. If her credentials check out, and I'm betting they do, this whole thing is going to blow back on us hard." But Sullivan ignored her, ignored the reasonable advice that could have saved his career if he had just listened to it, and he stood there with his arms crossed and his jaw set in that particular expression of stubborn refusal that people wear when they've dug themselves into a position they can't back out of without admitting they were wrong from the start. Vanessa looked at him and recognized that expression, had seen it before on the faces of people who couldn't acknowledge that they'd made an error in judgment, because doing so would require them to confront assumptions and biases they preferred to keep buried under layers of rationalization and denial. And she knew in that moment that this situation wasn't going to be resolved by reason or logic or appeals to common sense, because none of those things could penetrate the wall of certainty that Sullivan had built around his initial assumption. So Vanessa tried a different approach, softening her voice slightly, trying to reach whatever part of him might still be capable of seeing her as a human being, rather than as a problem to be contained. "Officer Sullivan," She said, her tone more measured, now more deliberate. "I understand you believe you're doing your job, and I respect that. But my job is to safely transport 198 people to Atlanta. Every minute I'm standing in this corridor is a minute those people are waiting, and some of them have connecting flights to catch, some of them have medical appointments they can't miss. Some of them are traveling to funerals or weddings or jobs that they'll lose if they don't arrive on time. I'm asking you as a professional to verify my credentials with one simple phone call so that I can go do my job and those 198 people can get to where they need to be." There was a moment, just a brief flicker of something that might have been doubt or uncertainty crossing Sullivan's face, and his hand moved slightly toward the radio clipped to his belt as though he might actually make the call that would end this entire encounter. But then footsteps echoed in the corridor, fast and purposeful, and suddenly the small space was filled with people. Janet Reeves appearing first, with her operations credential held up like a badge, her expression carrying the kind of controlled fury that comes from discovering that something completely unacceptable is happening on your watch. And behind her, Thomas Wright in his airport operations manager uniform, and behind him, Maya Rodriguez, who had left her gate podium to bear witness to whatever was about to happen, and the entire dynamic in that corridor shifted in an instant from a private detention to a very public confrontation that Sullivan could no longer control or contain. Janet Reeves walked directly up to Officer Sullivan and held out her credentials so he could read it clearly. And when she spoke, her voice was controlled but carried the accumulated weight of 23 years of not being played with 23 years of knowing exactly what her authority was and how to use it. "This is Captain Vanessa Cole." She said, her words clipped and precise, each one landing like a hammer. "She is the pilot in command of Transatlantic Flight TA-889. She is one of our most senior captains with 21 years of experience and a completely spotless record. Her credentials are valid, her identity is verified, and you need to release her right now so she can go do her job." Sullivan looked at Janet, looked at Thomas. Wright looked back at Vanessa, and, in the body camera footage that would later be reviewed by internal affairs investigators and civilian oversight boards and news organizations around the world, you could see the exact moment when reality penetrated his certainty, when he understood that he had miscalculated badly, that the story he had been constructing in his head about a woman impersonating an airline captain had just been dismantled piece by piece in front of multiple witnesses who would all remember exactly what had happened here. It wasn't remorse that crossed his face, wasn't embarrassment or apology, but rather something closer to cold calculation, the look of someone who was running through his options and realizing that none of them were good, that he had backed himself into a corner from which there was no graceful exit. He stepped aside without saying a word, without offering any explanation or apology or acknowledgement that he had just wasted 22 minutes of a captain's time and delayed a commercial flight for absolutely no legitimate reason whatsoever. And Vanessa Cole straightened her jacket, picked up her flight bag, and walked out of that corridor without looking at Officer Sullivan again, because he had already taken enough of her time and attention and energy, and she had 198 passengers waiting for her and a flight to Atlanta that was now running 24 minutes behind schedule through absolutely no fault of her own. Vanessa walked with Janet Reeves directly to Gate B-17, her stride purposeful and her spine straight, despite the fact that everything inside her felt shaky and uncertain in the aftermath of what had just happened. The adrenaline that had been keeping her steady throughout the detention now beginning to drain away and leave behind exhaustion and anger and a bone-deep weariness that had nothing to do with the early morning hour and everything to do with the accumulated weight of fighting battles that should never have been necessary in the first place. Maya Rodriguez held the gate door open as Vanessa approached, her expression a mixture of relief and concern and barely suppressed outrage at what had been done to this captain. She had worked with so many times before, and Vanessa gave her a small nod of acknowledgement and thanks before walking down the jet bridge toward her aircraft, her flight bag rolling behind her, her mind already shifting into the professional mode she would need to fly this plane safely, despite everything that had just happened. The flight attendants looked up as she entered the aircraft, their faces showing the relief of seeing their captain finally arrive, mixed with questions they were professional enough not to ask while passengers were boarding, and Vanessa moved past them with a reassuring nod and stepped into the cockpit, where David Callahan was waiting in the right seat, his expression tight with concern, and his hands gripping the armrests with enough force that his knuckles had gone white. "Captain," he said, his voice careful and measured, but his eyes searching her face for signs of damage or distress. "We were worried." "Are you okay?" Vanessa settled into the left seat, her hands finding their familiar positions on the controls, these instruments that knew her and responded to her and trusted her in a way that Officer Garrett Sullivan never would, and she took a breath that she hoped David wouldn't recognize as shaky. "I'm here now," she said, her voice steadying as she spoke, finding its professional cadence again. "Let's get these people home." David wanted to ask what had happened, wanted to know if she needed a moment before they started the departure sequence, wanted to offer something that might help or comfort or acknowledge the injustice of what he suspected she had just endured. But he also knew Vanessa well enough after 3 years of flying together to understand that what she needed right now was not conversation or sympathy, but rather the familiar routine of flying, the comfort of checklists and procedures, and the ordered world of aviation where everything had a purpose and a place and a reason. So he simply said, "We're good to go whenever you are, Captain." And Vanessa nodded and began working through the pre-flight checklist, with the same methodical precision she brought to every flight, her voice calm and professional, as she called out items and David confirmed them. The rhythm of their coordination as smooth and practiced as it had ever been, despite the 24-minute delay that would be officially recorded as crew access delay, but that both of them knew had nothing to do with access and everything to do with bias. The pushback happened at 7:49, 24 minutes late, and as the aircraft rolled backward from the gate, Vanessa could see through the cockpit window the stream of passengers still making their way through the terminal, could see the gate agents closing up their podiums, could see the normal flow of an airport morning continuing around them as though nothing extraordinary had happened, as though a captain hadn't just been detained without cause while her flight waited. The taxi to the runway was smooth, the communication with ground control routine and professional, and when Vanessa advanced the throttles and felt the aircraft accelerate down runway 36R, she experienced the familiar sensation of physics taking over, of lift generating beneath the wings of the moment when the nose wheel left the ground and they were flying airborne, free from the earth and all its complicated human assumptions and biases. The flight to Atlanta was textbook perfect, the kind of smooth professional operation that Vanessa had executed hundreds of times before the autopilot managing the cruise portion, while she and David monitored systems and communicated with air traffic control and worked through all the small tasks that kept a commercial flight running safely and efficiently. Passengers in the cabin had no idea that anything unusual had happened, had no way of knowing that their captain had been detained and questioned and forced to defend her right to wear the uniform she was currently wearing, and Vanessa was grateful for that ignorance because these people had trusted her with their safety and their lives, and they deserved to arrive in Atlanta without the burden of knowing how close they had come to having their flight delayed even longer, or potentially canceled entirely if that situation in the corridor had escalated further. The approach into Atlanta was smooth, the landing so gentle that several passengers applauded when the wheels touched down on the runway, and Vanessa taxied to the gate with the same calm competence she had displayed throughout the entire flight, bringing the aircraft to a precise stop at the jet bridge and completing the shutdown checklist with David in perfect coordination. When the seatbelt sign turned off and passengers began standing to retrieve their carry-on luggage from the overhead bins, Vanessa unbuckled her harness and stood at the cockpit door, as she always did, saying goodbye to each passenger as they deplaned, her smile professional and warm, and giving no indication of the turmoil that was still churning beneath her carefully maintained exterior. Several passengers who had heard rumors spreading through the cabin during the flight, whispers about the captain being stopped by police, questions about why the departure had been delayed, stopped to say something to her as they passed, their words varying but their sentiment consistent. An elderly black man in a worn suit shook her hand and held it for a long moment, his eyes meeting hers with an understanding that needed no explanation, and he said simply, "Thank you, Captain." And those two words carried the weight of solidarity and recognition and shared experience. A young white woman, maybe 24 years old, stopped and said with genuine emotion in her voice, "What they did to you was wrong. I saw it online already. I'm so sorry." And Vanessa thanked her quietly, because what else could she say? What response was adequate to acknowledge both the apology and the fact that apologies couldn't undo what had happened or prevent it from happening again to someone else? And then Zoe Bennett appeared in the aisle with her grandmother Patricia close behind, and Zoe stopped in front of Vanessa and looked up at her with eyes that were wide and serious, and somehow both young and old at the same time. And she said in a voice that was clear and certain, "You're a real captain." Vanessa felt something shift in her chest at those words, at the simple declarative statement from a 9-year-old girl who had watched the entire detention unfold and who had apparently needed to confirm for herself that reality matched what she had seen. She knelt down to Zoe's height, bringing herself to eye level with this child who had witnessed something that no child should have to see, and she said with absolute conviction, "I am a real captain. And one day, if you want to be, you can be a real captain too." "Even though I'm black?" Zoe asked the question, carrying the weight of everything she had learned that morning, all the assumptions and barriers and limitations that she was beginning to understand would be placed in her path simply because of how she looked. Vanessa felt her throat tighten, but she kept her voice steady and strong. "Especially because you're black," she said, investing each word with every ounce of certainty and determination she possessed. "We belong in this cockpit just as much as anyone else. Don't let anyone tell you different." Patricia Bennett's eyes were glistening as she watched this exchange, and she stepped forward and showed Vanessa the recording on her phone, the clear footage of the detention that she had captured through the terminal glass. "I got everything," Patricia said quietly. "Every minute of it. If you need this, if it would help, it's yours." Vanessa looked at the phone screen, saw herself standing in that corridor with her credentials visible and her posture dignified while Officer Sullivan questioned her right to exist in her professional space, and she felt a complicated mixture of gratitude and grief wash over her. Grateful that someone had thought to document what happened, grieving that such documentation had been necessary in the first place. She pulled out her own phone and took down Patricia's contact information, thanked her quietly, and stood back up as the last few passengers deplaned, and the aircraft finally fell silent except for the flight attendants moving through the cabin collecting trash and preparing for the next flight. Vanessa sat back down in the left seat, the familiar captain's chair that she had occupied on hundreds of flights, and she pulled out her laptop because there was something she needed to do while everything was still fresh in her mind, while the timeline was still clear and the details were still sharp and specific. Most people who had just experienced what she had experienced would have gone home and vented to a friend or posted something angry on social media, and let the frustration gradually dissolve over time, would have accepted that the system was designed to exhaust you into silence and that fighting back required more energy than most people had to give. But Captain Vanessa Cole was not most people, and she had spent 21 years learning that the only way to create change was to document everything, to demand accountability, to refuse to let these moments disappear into the background noise of daily injustices that people preferred not to see. What she wrote that afternoon sitting in the cockpit of a grounded aircraft at Atlanta's Hartsfield-Jackson International Airport was not an angry social media post, but a formal complaint, and it was extraordinary in its thoroughness and precision and unassailable documentation. The document that Captain Vanessa Cole created over the next 4 hours was 16 pages long, single-spaced, structured with the same systematic precision that she brought to pre-flight planning and emergency procedures, and it would become the foundation for everything that followed the investigation, the policy changes, the national conversation, the reckoning that would force institutions to confront patterns they had preferred to ignore. She began with a precise timeline that pulled from multiple sources of verifiable data. Her own phone logs showing when she had badged into the airport at 6:15 a.m., the gate departure logs that Maya Rodriguez had accessed showing the scheduled versus actual pushback times, the timestamp from Patricia Bennett's video recording that captured the exact moment Officer Sullivan first stopped her in the corridor, and even the radio transmission logs that would show when Sullivan called dispatch to report that he had detained someone possibly impersonating airline personnel. Every claim she made was supported by documentary evidence, every assertion backed up by data that could be independently verified, and she organized it all with the clarity of someone who understood that vague complaints based on feelings or impressions would be easy to dismiss. But specific allegations supported by timestamps and witness names and physical evidence would be much harder to ignore. She included a detailed account of every statement Officer Sullivan had made during the detention, reproducing his words as accurately as her memory allowed, and noting where Patricia's video recording or Sullivan's own body camera would be able to confirm or clarify her recollection. She documented the moment he demanded to see her identification, the way he examined her credentials with exaggerated skepticism, despite their obvious validity, his use of the word impersonating in his radio call despite having no factual basis for that characterization, and his refusal to contact airline operations for verification even after Officer Williams explicitly suggested he do so. She noted the duration of the detention, 22 minutes from initial stop to final release, and she contextualized that duration by explaining that every minute of delay in a captain's arrival at the aircraft creates cascading consequences for flight operations. Passenger connections, crew scheduling, and overall airline efficiency, making it clear that this was not simply a personal inconvenience, but a disruption that affected nearly 200 people and multiple interconnected systems. The complaint included a section identifying the specific airport authority policies that she believed had been violated during the stop, and she cited chapter and verse from the Airport Police Department's own procedures manual regarding the interaction with credentialed airline personnel, the requirements for reasonable, articulable suspicion before initiating a detention, and the protocols for verification that should have been followed if Sullivan had legitimate questions about her credentials. She included another section on FAA regulations pertaining to the non-interference of airline crew during pre-departure procedures, making it clear that the detention had not only violated airport policies, but had also potentially compromised federal aviation safety regulations by delaying a captain's arrival at her aircraft during critical pre-flight preparation time. She was building a case that was simultaneously about her individual experience and about broader patterns of conduct that had implications far beyond this single incident, and she structured every paragraph to make both arguments simultaneously without diluting the power of either one. The witness section was particularly thorough, listing the names and contact information for everyone who had observed or participated in the encounter Maya Rodriguez, who had witnessed the initial stop and immediately called operations. Janet Reeves, who had arrived in the corridor and provided professional verification of Vanessa's identity and credentials. Officer Keisha Williams, whose body camera had captured her attempt to get Sullivan to call operations for verification. Thomas Wright, the airport operations manager who had accompanied Janet to the corridor. David Callahan, her first officer, who could testify to the unusual delay and the impact it had on flight operations, and Patricia Bennett, who had independent video documentation of the entire encounter from a passenger perspective. Next to each name, she noted the specific information that witness could corroborate, making it easy for investigators to understand what each person had seen and heard, and why their testimony mattered, essentially creating a roadmap for anyone who wanted to verify every single claim she was making. But the most important element of the complaint was the formal request she included for the preservation and immediate review of all video footage related to the incident. And she was specific about exactly which recordings she wanted secured before they could be overwritten or archived, or mysteriously lost in the way that evidence sometimes disappeared when it threatened to expose uncomfortable truths. She requested the main corridor security camera footage that would show her walking through the terminal in full uniform before being stopped by Sullivan, the side corridor camera footage that would show the detention itself, Officer Sullivan's body camera recording that would capture every word spoken during the encounter and would prove that her credentials were clearly visible throughout, and any gate camera or additional security footage that might have captured relevant portions of the timeline. She also noted that passenger Patricia Bennett had independent video documentation that she was willing to provide, and she included Patricia's contact information so that investigators could obtain that footage as well. The message was clear. Every moment of this encounter was documented from multiple angles, and any investigation that wanted to understand what actually happened would have access to evidence that could not be disputed or reinterpreted or explained away. Vanessa sent the completed complaint to 5 recipients simultaneously, using certified email that would create a record of when each organization received it, and would make it impossible for anyone to claim they hadn't been notified the Meridian Airport Police Department, Internal Affairs Division, the Airport Civilian Oversight Board, that was supposed to provide community accountability for police conduct, Transatlantic Airways Corporate Legal Department, the FAA Regional Office for the Southeast Region, and the Department of Transportation's Civil Rights Complaint Division. She was filing this through every available channel at once, ensuring that no single entity could bury it or slow-walk it or decide it wasn't worth investigating, creating a situation where multiple organizations would be watching each other and asking questions about what actions were being taken and whether accountability was being pursued seriously. Janet Reeves received a copy of the complaint that same afternoon because Vanessa wanted the airline to understand exactly what had happened and what she was doing about it, and Janet read it twice the second time with Thomas Wright looking over her shoulder, and when she finished, she picked up her phone and called her supervisor at Transatlantic headquarters, and said in a voice that was tight with controlled anger, "We have a problem, and it starts with us too. Because this is the 4th time in 18 months that I've heard about a black crew member having an uncomfortable interaction with airport security, and this is the first time anyone has documented it thoroughly enough that we can't pretend it's isolated incidents or miscommunication or anything other than what it obviously is." The Meridian Airport Police Department received the complaint on a Thursday afternoon, and by the following Monday morning, 4 business days later, which was extraordinarily fast for any government bureaucracy, Officer Garrett Sullivan had been placed on administrative leave pending a formal internal affairs investigation, and that speed was a direct reflection of the quality and thoroughness of Vanessa's filing because there was nothing ambiguous in it, nothing vague or emotional or easy to dismiss as a misunderstanding, just 16 pages of documented facts and verifiable evidence that demanded answers and accountability. The internal affairs investigator assigned to the case was Lieutenant Rosa Pacheco, a 45-year-old woman with 19 years of experience in law enforcement and a reputation inside the Meridian Airport Police Department for being thorough to the point of obsessive and completely immune to political pressure or departmental loyalty when she believed wrongdoing had occurred. Rosa had investigated dozens of officer conduct cases over her career, had seen good cops make bad mistakes and bad cops hide behind badges, and she had developed a finely tuned instinct for distinguishing between legitimate errors in judgment that could be corrected through training and deeper patterns of misconduct that indicated someone had no business wearing a badge in the first place. She read Vanessa's complaint on Monday morning while drinking her second cup of coffee at her desk, and by the time she reached page 16, she had made 3 decisions. First, this complaint was credible and serious and deserved immediate attention. Second, the body camera footage and security recordings needed to be pulled and preserved before anything could be deleted or corrupted. And third, she needed to review not just this incident, but Sullivan's entire history with the department to see if there were patterns that previous supervisors had missed or chosen to ignore. She spent Monday afternoon pulling every piece of video footage that Vanessa had requested in her complaint, watching the main corridor security camera first and seeing exactly what Vanessa had described, a captain in full uniform with visible credentials walking through the terminal being stopped by an officer who had no apparent reason for the stop beyond his own assumptions. She watched it, once took notes, and then watched it again with a colleague from the investigation unit to make sure her interpretation wasn't being colored by her own expectations or biases. And when her colleague finished watching, he looked at her and said, "That's a problem." And Rosa nodded, because yes, that was absolutely a problem, a major problem that was about to get worse when they reviewed the rest of the footage. The body camera recording was even more damaging because it captured everything with perfect audio clarity. Sullivan's initial challenge of where Vanessa thought she was going dressed like that, his examination of her credentials that took far longer than necessary, his radio call describing her as possibly impersonating airline personnel despite having just examined valid federal aviation documents, and critically Officer Williams's quiet suggestion that he call operations immediately, followed by his decision not to do so for another 12 minutes. Rosa listened to that exchange 3 times, made careful notes about the exact timestamps, and flagged it as particularly significant because it demonstrated that Sullivan had been advised by a fellow officer to verify Vanessa's credentials through proper channels and had actively chosen not to follow that reasonable suggestion, which indicated that this wasn't about legitimate security concerns, but about something else, something that had more to do with his assumptions than her credentials. Patricia Bennett's passenger video added another layer of documentation, because it showed the encounter from an external perspective, capturing the way other uniformed crew members walked freely past Sullivan during the detention without being stopped or questioned. And Rosa noted that detail carefully because it would matter later when she had to establish whether Sullivan's actions represented standard security protocol or selective enforcement based on factors that had nothing to do with security. She watched a white male pilot, probably in his 50s and wearing the same Transatlantic Airways uniform that Vanessa was wearing, walk directly past Sullivan during the detention, without even a glance from the officer, and that single moment captured on a passenger's phone told Rosa everything she needed to know about whether this stop had been based on legitimate security concerns or on assumptions about who belonged in a captain's uniform. But the most significant finding came when Rosa began reviewing Sullivan's body camera archive from the previous 8 months, looking for patterns in his interactions with airline crew members. And what she found made her call in her supervisor and show him the recordings without commentary, because she wanted his unfiltered reaction before she explained what she was seeing. The archive revealed 3 prior incidents where Sullivan had stopped individuals in crew uniforms for what he had characterized in his incident notes, when he bothered to document them at all, as routine credential verification, and in all 3 cases the crew members were black. 2 women and 1 man, and in all 3 cases the stops lasted between 8 and 15 minutes, despite the crew members having valid credentials, and in none of the 3 cases had Sullivan documented the stops in official reports or filed them through proper channels. They had simply been logged automatically in the body camera archive system that preserved footage for 90 days before deletion. Rosa compared these incidents to Sullivan's interactions with white crew members over the same time period, pulling random samples from his body camera archive and reviewing how he engaged with people in airline uniforms. And what she found was a stark contrast. White crew members were typically greeted professionally, if Sullivan interacted with them at all. Their credentials were accepted at face value when they were checked. Stops, if they occurred, lasted no more than 2 or 3 minutes, and Sullivan's tone was consistently respectful and collegial, in a way that was completely absent from his interactions with black crew members. The pattern was undeniable once you knew to look for it, and Rosa knew that this was no longer about a single incident, but about conduct that demonstrated bias so consistent and so clearly documented that it couldn't be explained away as isolated misunderstandings or innocent mistakes. She spent 23 days conducting the investigation, which was extraordinarily fast for a formal internal affairs review of a sworn officer. but which reflected the fact that the evidence was so thoroughly documented by Vanessa's complaint and so clearly supported by multiple video sources that the investigation was essentially confirming what was already on paper, rather than trying to piece together a story from conflicting accounts and unreliable memories. Rosa interviewed every witness Vanessa had listed, reviewed every piece of video footage from multiple angles, examined Sullivan's complete employment history with the department, including his training records and previous performance evaluations, and consulted with aviation security experts to understand whether Sullivan's actions fell within any reasonable interpretation of legitimate security protocols. The answer to that last question was an unequivocal no. Every expert she consulted confirmed that a credentialed airline crew member in full uniform should be able to move through a secured airport terminal without being stopped for verification, unless there was specific articulable suspicion of credential forgery or identity theft. And Sullivan had never articulated any such specific suspicion, had simply stopped Vanessa because her presence in a captain's uniform had triggered some assumption in his mind that she didn't belong there. The department's official findings, released in a formal statement at the end of those 23 days, were devastating in their directness and their refusal to soften or qualify what had happened. The report found that Officer Sullivan had initiated a stop of a credentialed airline crew member without reasonable articulable cause, that his characterization of the stop in his radio call as involving possible impersonation was unsupported by any observable evidence, and was inconsistent with the training materials governing crew interaction at commercial airport facilities, that his delay in contacting airline operations, despite being advised to do so by Officer Williams, extended the detention beyond any justifiable period, and that review of prior body camera footage revealed a pattern of conduct consistent with racially discriminatory enforcement practices that had no place in professional law enforcement. The department recommended termination, and Officer Garrett Sullivan resigned before that formal termination could be processed, his 8-year career at Meridian Airport Police, ending not with the ceremony and recognition that typically accompanied a resignation, but with a quiet exit and a personnel file that would follow him to any future law enforcement position he might seek. Officer Garrett Sullivan, former Officer Garrett Sullivan, he had to remind himself every morning when he woke up without a badge or a uniform or a purpose that had defined him for the past 8 years, sat at his kitchen table 6 days after his resignation and watched Patricia Bennett's video play on his laptop screen for the 15th or maybe 20th time. He had lost count. Watching himself stand in that corridor and block a captain's path and question her credentials and use the word impersonating into his radio while she stood there in full uniform with every piece of documentation clearly visible around her neck. The video had gone viral in the days since the investigation concluded, had been viewed over 8 million times across various platforms, and the comment section was brutal in its assessment of what people saw when they watched a white officer with platinum blonde hair stop a black woman captain and refuse to let her go to her aircraft despite her obviously valid credentials. That woman had 4 stripes, and he still didn't believe her one comment read, and it had been upvoted thousands of times. "This is what racism looks like with a badge," said another. "I would trust her with my life before I'd trust him with a parking ticket," wrote someone else. Sullivan had read through hundreds of these comments over the past few days, had subjected himself to this public judgment in a way that felt like necessary penance, even though it made him sick to his stomach. And the worst part wasn't the anger in the comments, or the calls for him to be prosecuted, or the people who said he was a disgrace to law enforcement. The worst part was the comments that simply stated facts. She had the uniform. She had the credentials. She had 16,000 flight hours. What else did she need to prove? Those comments cut deeper than the insults because they asked a question. Sullivan didn't want to answer a question that required him to examine assumptions and biases that he had successfully avoided confronting for his entire adult life. His wife Emily appeared in the kitchen doorway, her blonde hair pulled back in a messy ponytail, her expression a mixture of concern and something else that Sullivan couldn't quite identify but that felt uncomfortably close to disappointment, and she watched him. Watching the video for a moment before asking quietly, "Garrett, why did you stop her?" "I was doing my job," Sullivan said, automatically the same response he had given to the internal affairs investigator and to his union representative and to himself every time the question arose. But the words felt hollow even as he spoke them because he could see the video right there on the screen, showing exactly what doing his job had looked like from the outside. "Your job is to stop pilots with valid credentials?" Emily asked, and there was an edge to her voice now. Not anger exactly, but a sharpness that came from watching her husband's career implode and still not understanding why he had made the choices that led to this outcome. Sullivan wanted to explain that he had seen something that didn't fit, that airline captains, in his experience, were usually older, white men, and this woman didn't match that template that he had been trained to notice anomalies and investigate anything that seemed out of place. But even as these rationalizations formed in his mind, he recognized them for what they were. Excuses for bias, attempts to justify a stop that had been based not on security concerns, but on his own narrow assumptions about who belonged in positions of authority. "I didn't know the credentials were valid until I checked them," he said. But even that defense crumbled under the slightest scrutiny, because the body camera footage showed that he had examined those credentials and still called dispatch to report possible impersonation, still refused to call operations for verification even after his colleague suggested it. "You saw her uniform?" Emily said, her voice quiet but firm. "You saw her badge. You saw the 4 stripes that mean she's a captain. What else did you need, Garrett? What else did you need?" That she didn't already have Sullivan close the laptop because he couldn't watch the video anymore. Couldn't see himself making the same stupid decisions over and over again in perfect, high-definition clarity. And he put his head in his hands and said to the table rather than to his wife, "I don't know. I don't know what I was thinking." Footsteps on the stairs announced the arrival of their 12-year-old daughter, Lily, and Sullivan looked up to see her standing in the doorway wearing her school uniform and carrying her backpack. And she looked at her father with an expression that was far too serious for a child her age, and asked, "Dad, is that the lady you stopped? The one everyone's talking about at school?" Sullivan felt something crack open in his chest, because he hadn't realized that this had followed him into his daughter's school, into her social world, into the space where she was building her understanding of right and wrong and who her father was. "Don't worry about it, Lil," he said, trying to keep his voice light and dismissive. "It's just some work stuff that got complicated." "But she's a pilot though, right?" Lily persisted because 12-year-olds had not yet learned to let uncomfortable topics drop in the name of social grace. "She had the uniform and everything." "Why did you stop someone who's a pilot?" "Mrs. Harrison at school says that when you wear a uniform it means you earned it, that you worked hard to get the right to wear those clothes." "Did that lady not earn her uniform?" "She earned it." "Lily?" Sullivan said, his voice coming out sharper than he intended, because the question cut too close to something he didn't want to examine. "It's complicated, okay? It's adult stuff." Lily looked at her father for a long moment, and then she said something that would echo in Sullivan's mind for months afterward. "It doesn't look complicated, Dad. It just looks mean." She went back upstairs to finish getting ready for school, leaving Sullivan and Emily sitting in heavy silence, and finally, Emily said what she had been avoiding saying for days. "She's right. It does look mean. And I don't understand how you could do something like that to someone who clearly belonged exactly where she was." Sullivan sat there in his kitchen, unemployed and unemployable in law enforcement, his career destroyed not by a single moment of bad judgment, but by a pattern of bias that had been operating beneath his conscious awareness for years. And he finally allowed himself to ask the question he had been avoiding. What had he actually seen when he looked at Captain Vanessa Cole walking through that terminal in full uniform with valid credentials? Had he seen a security threat, or had he seen a black woman in a captain's uniform, and decided that those two things didn't belong together? that she must be wrong somehow because she didn't match the picture he carried in his head of what authority looked like. The answer was there in the body camera footage, in the way he had stopped her while waving white pilots through, in the skepticism he had shown toward credentials that were obviously valid, in his refusal to verify what could have been verified in 30 seconds with a single phone call. The answer was there, and Sullivan was finally, reluctantly beginning to see it. By day 10 after the incident, Patricia Bennett's passenger video had been viewed 34 million times across YouTube, Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook, and that number was still climbing exponentially as news outlets picked up the story and television programs ran segments analyzing what the video showed and what it meant about bias in law enforcement and who got questioned and who got trusted when they claimed authority. The airport security camera footage and Officer Sullivan's body camera recording had been released through a public records request filed jointly by 3 news organizations, and when that official footage became available, the combined viewership across all platforms exceeded 52 million within 48 hours, making this one of the most watched incidents of its kind in recent memory. A viral phenomenon that had transcended the usual attention span of internet outrage and had instead become a sustained conversation about credentials and perception, and the gap between what people earn and what others are willing to acknowledge. News outlets from the United States, United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, and a dozen other countries ran stories about the detention, each approaching it from slightly different angles. Some focused on the aviation industry and the barriers Black women faced in becoming pilots. Some examined the legal questions around what constituted reasonable cause for detaining credentialed airline crew. Some looked at airport security protocols and whether Sullivan's actions represented standard practice or individual misconduct. And some simply told the story of what happened with minimal commentary and let the footage speak for itself. Aviation industry publications ran detailed analyses of the stop from a regulatory standpoint, explaining the federal requirements for crew credentials and the protocols that should govern security interaction with airline personnel, and several of these publications interviewed current and former pilots who shared their own experiences with being questioned or stopped despite having valid documentation. What emerged from these interviews was a pattern that was both disturbing and predictable. Black pilots across the country came forward with stories that echoed Vanessa's experience. Stories of being stopped in terminals and questioned about whether they were really pilots, of having their credentials examined with skepticism that white colleagues never faced, of being asked by passengers if they were really qualified to fly the plane, of navigating a professional world that seemed determined to treat them as anomalies rather than as the fully credentialed professionals they obviously were. One retired Black male captain, 68 years old with 40 years of commercial flying experience, recorded a video response that went viral in its own right, and in it, he spoke directly to the camera with tears running down his face as he said, "I've been stopped 12 times in 30 years. 12 times while wearing this uniform with these credentials. And every single time I had to prove I belonged somewhere I had already proven I belonged just by having the training and the license and the job. 12 times. White pilots also began posting responses, some expressing solidarity and acknowledging that they had never once been stopped or questioned, despite walking through the exact same terminals wearing the exact same uniforms, some sharing stories of witnessing Black colleagues being treated differently and not having the courage or the awareness to intervene, some simply stating that what happened to Captain Cole was unacceptable, and that the aviation community needed to do better at protecting all of its members from this kind of bias. The diversity of responses created a broader conversation about who gets assumed to be competent and who has to constantly prove it, who gets trust as a default, and who has to earn it over and over again, despite having already earned it through years of training and certification and perfect performance. The Wings of Hope nonprofit organization, where Vanessa volunteered as a mentor, received over 8,400 new applications in the 2 weeks following the video's viral spread, a tenfold increase in their normal application volume, and the organization's director told reporters that the phones had been ringing constantly with young Black girls calling to ask about the program. girls who had seen Captain Vanessa Cole stand with dignity in that corridor and had decided that if she could face that kind of scrutiny and still fly the plane and still maintain her professionalism, then maybe they could do it too. Several of these young applicants wrote letters that the organization shared on social media letters that said things like, "I saw Captain Cole get stopped by that policeman, and I saw her stay calm and prove who she was, and then fly her plane anyway. And I want to be like her when I grow up." And those letters became their own viral phenomenon, evidence that even the most painful moments could plant seeds of inspiration in unexpected places. Zoe Bennett, the 9-year-old who had watched the detention unfold and had asked her grandmother why the police officer was being mean to the pilot, became a small celebrity in her own right when local news stations interviewed Patricia about the video she had recorded, and Zoe appeared in the background of those interviews looking serious and determined beyond her years. When one reporter asked Zoe what she thought about what she had seen that morning, she looked directly into the camera and said with absolute conviction, "I'm going to be a pilot like Captain Cole when I grow up, and nobody's going to tell me I can't because I'm black, because Captain Cole proved that we belong in the sky just as much as anybody else." The clip of Zoe's declaration went viral separately from the original detention video, accumulating over 4 million views in its own right, and people in the comments section said things like, "This 9-year-old has more clarity than most adults," and "She just summarized the entire civil rights movement in one sentence, and Captain Cole may not know it yet, but she just inspired the next generation of black pilots." The public reaction was not uniform. There were people who criticized Vanessa for not being more forceful in the moment. People who said she should have refused to go to the side corridor, or should have demanded to speak to a supervisor immediately, or should have been less cooperative with a stop they viewed as illegal from the start. There were people who argued that her calm approach was a survival strategy forced on her by circumstances that should never have existed, that black professionals were required to maintain composure in situations where white professionals would have been allowed to show anger or frustration without consequences. But there were also people who argued that Vanessa's calm professionalism was precisely what made the footage so powerful that it stripped away every excuse and every rationalization that Officer Sullivan might have offered, because there was nothing in her behavior that could be pointed to as justification for the stop. Nothing she had done or said that could be twisted into evidence that she was somehow the problem. The video showed a woman standing straight and speaking clearly and maintaining her dignity while being subjected to scrutiny that should never have happened, and that contrast between her professionalism and Sullivan's assumptions made the injustice impossible to ignore or explain away. The investigation concluded on day 23 with the release of a formal report that was devastating in its directness and its refusal to cushion its findings in bureaucratic language that might have allowed people to avoid confronting the full implications of what had occurred. Lieutenant Rosa Pacheco's investigative summary ran to 47 pages, including exhibits and witness statements, but the core findings could be summarized in language that was precise and unambiguous. Officer Garrett Sullivan had stopped Captain Vanessa Cole without reasonable cause, had characterized her as possibly impersonating airline personnel despite having examined valid credentials that disproved that characterization, had extended her detention beyond any justifiable period by refusing to contact airline operations for verification, and had demonstrated through review of prior conduct a pattern of interactions with black crew members that was inconsistent with how he treated white crew members in identical circumstances. The report didn't use euphemisms or softening language to describe what it had found. It stated clearly that the evidence demonstrated racially discriminatory enforcement practices, that Sullivan's decision-making had been influenced by bias rather than security concerns, and that his conduct violated both department policy and the constitutional rights of the person he had detained. The recommendations section was equally direct: immediate termination of employment referral to the State Law Enforcement Standards Board for potential decertification that would prevent him from working as a police officer anywhere in the state, mandatory training for all airport police personnel on implicit bias and appropriate interaction with credentialed airline crew, and implementation of new oversight mechanisms to identify and address similar patterns before they resulted in civil rights violations. The Civilian Oversight Board that reviewed the internal affairs findings held a public hearing where they heard testimony from Vanessa, from several of the witnesses, from aviation security experts, and from Sullivan himself, who appeared with his attorney and gave a statement that was carefully worded to avoid admitting liability, while also expressing regret for the situation that had occurred. Sullivan's statement said that he had been trying to follow security protocols, that he had made decisions in good faith, based on the information available to him at the time, that he never intended to discriminate against anyone based on race or any other protected characteristic, and that he had resigned from the police department in order to take responsibility for his actions and to allow the department to move forward. The statement was exactly the kind of non-apology that attorneys craft to minimize legal exposure, while creating the appearance of accountability, and the Civilian Oversight Board members listened to it with expressions that made clear they understood the gap between what Sullivan was saying and what the evidence showed he had actually done. The board's own findings, released 2 weeks after the public hearing, went even further than the internal affairs report in characterizing what had happened and what it represented. The board noted that this incident was not simply about one officer making a bad decision, but rather exposed deficiencies in training, supervision, and accountability that had allowed a pattern of biased conduct to persist undetected for years. They noted that Sullivan's body camera archive showing 3 previous stops of black crew members should have been identified through routine supervisory review, but had instead been preserved only because of the department's automated archive system, suggesting that supervisors either weren't reviewing footage regularly or weren't recognizing problematic patterns when they saw them. They recommended comprehensive reform of how the department trained officers on bias recognition, how supervisors monitored officer conduct, and how complaints about discriminatory treatment were investigated and resolved. But Lieutenant Rosa Pacheco's report included one additional recommendation that went beyond punishment or policy changes, and it reflected her understanding that simply firing Sullivan and implementing new training wouldn't address the deeper question of what happened to officers whose bias had been exposed, but who hadn't yet committed acts serious enough to warrant criminal prosecution. She wrote in her concluding section, "Officer Sullivan should not simply be separated from this department and allowed to disappear into another profession where his biases might cause different kinds of harm." The pattern of conduct documented in this investigation suggests not malice, but rather deeply ingrained bias that went unexamined and unchallenged for years. Termination addresses the immediate problem of removing him from a position where he can abuse authority, but it doesn't address the underlying issue of how someone develops and maintains these biases without ever questioning them. This board should consider whether a restorative justice approach might serve both accountability and prevention better than simple termination alone. The recommendation was forwarded to the Civilian Oversight Board, which debated it extensively before deciding on a hybrid approach that acknowledged both the need for consequences and the potential value of rehabilitation. Sullivan's resignation would stand preventing him from returning to law enforcement in Meridian, or likely anywhere else given the national publicity the case had received. But he would be offered participation in a restorative justice program that would require him to examine his biases to understand the harm his actions had caused, to meet with affected community members if they chose to participate, and to develop concrete plans for how he would ensure his future conduct reflected different values than his past behavior had demonstrated. The alternative to participation was referral of his case to federal authorities for investigation of potential civil rights violations, and facing that choice, Sullivan chose the restorative program. The Meridian Airport Police Department's response to the investigation's findings went far beyond the minimum requirements for compliance with the Oversight Board's recommendations, and that unusually comprehensive response was driven by a combination of factors. Genuine recognition among department leadership that serious deficiencies had been exposed, concern about potential federal intervention if reforms weren't implemented quickly and thoroughly, and awareness that the massive public attention on this case meant that half measures would be recognized and criticized immediately. The department partnered with Captain Vanessa Cole and a team of Black aviation professionals to develop a 12-hour mandatory training program that every airport police officer would be required to complete. And the curriculum they created was unlike the generic diversity training that many departments use to check compliance boxes without actually changing officer behavior or understanding. The training program, which was given the title Recognition Beyond Assumption, was structured around case studies and scenario-based learning rather than abstract lectures about bias, and it used real examples, including the detention of Captain Cole, to illustrate how assumptions about who belongs in certain professional roles can override evidence and credentials that should be determinative. The curriculum included detailed instruction on commercial aviation credentials and what officers should look for when verifying airline crew identification. But it also included substantial sections on implicit bias recognition and the specific patterns of discriminatory enforcement that research had shown were common, even among officers who consciously believed they treated everyone equally. The training didn't allow participants to retreat into comfortable generalizations about treating everyone the same. It required officers to examine their own assumptions, to acknowledge that bias operates beneath conscious awareness, and to develop specific strategies for catching and correcting biased decision-making in real time before it resulted in unjustified stops or discriminatory enforcement. Vanessa participated in developing the curriculum and also in delivering some of the training sessions herself, standing in front of rooms full of airport police officers in her captain's uniform and telling them directly and without softening her language what it felt like to walk through a terminal where she had worked for years and be stopped by someone who looked at her credentials and decided they couldn't possibly be real. She told them about the calculation she had made in that corridor, the decision to cooperate and stay calm and document everything rather than escalate or resist, and she explained that this calculation was something most of them would never have to make because their credentials would be accepted at face value, but that Black professionals made versions of that calculation dozens or hundreds of times throughout their careers, always assessing whether this would be the encounter where cooperation wasn't enough, where professionalism was interpreted as attitude, where the consequences of being right would still be worse than the injustice of being doubted. Some officers sat through these trainings with defensive body language and skeptical expressions, clearly uncomfortable with being told that their assumptions might be flawed or that they needed to examine their own biases, but others engaged seriously with the material, asking thoughtful questions about how to recognize when their gut instincts might be leading them wrong and how to build in verification steps that would catch discriminatory patterns before they became discriminatory actions. The department made the training mandatory annually, rather than a one-time requirement, recognizing that bias recognition was an ongoing practice, rather than a box to be checked. And they built assessment components into the training that required officers to demonstrate not just that they had attended, but that they had actually absorbed and could apply the concepts being taught. Beyond training, the department implemented a body camera review protocol that fundamentally changed how supervisors monitored officer conduct, requiring quarterly audits of footage from officers who had high numbers of public contacts, and looking specifically for patterns that might indicate discriminatory enforcement. The review protocol created a formal process for identifying officers who stopped or detained people of color at rates significantly higher than their white colleagues, and it required supervisors to investigate those disparities rather than assuming they reflected legitimate differences in where crime occurred or who posed security threats. The protocol also established clear guidelines for when supervisors should intervene with additional training or counseling, and when patterns suggested that an officer's biases were too entrenched to be corrected through training alone, providing an accountability mechanism that could catch problems before they escalated to civil rights violations. The department also established a direct communication line between airport police dispatch and airline operations centers, creating a system where crew identity verification could be completed in under 90 seconds when an officer had legitimate questions about credentials. The new system meant that if an officer stopped someone claiming to be airline crew, a single radio call to dispatch would trigger immediate verification with the airline's operations center, and that verification would come back with a simple yes or no answer about whether the person's credentials were valid and current. This removed any excuse for extended detentions, while officers verified information that could be confirmed almost instantly, and it created a clear record of which officers were using the verification system appropriately, and which ones were stopping crew members without bothering to verify their credentials through official channels. The Civilian Oversight Board received expanded authority as part of the reforms, gaining the power to access and review body camera footage proactively, rather than waiting for formal complaints to trigger review. And the board used this authority to conduct monthly random audits of officer interactions, looking for patterns or concerning conduct that might not have resulted in complaints, but that indicated potential problems. This proactive oversight represented a fundamental shift from reactive complaint investigation to preventive monitoring, acknowledging that people who experienced discrimination often chose not to file formal complaints because they didn't believe anything would change, or because they didn't want to spend emotional energy fighting battles they had already fought too many times before. Transatlantic Airways also implemented substantial changes in response to the incident, and these changes were driven partly by Captain Cole's complaint and partly by the airline's internal review, which discovered that there had been 4 informal reports from black crew members in the previous 18 months describing uncomfortable or inappropriate interactions with airport security at various hubs around the country. None of those previous reports had been escalated to management or had generated formal responses which suggested that the problem wasn't limited to Meridian Airport or to Officer Sullivan, but rather reflected broader patterns that the airline needed to address through better support for crew members who faced discrimination and clearer protocols for documenting and responding to such incidents. The airline established a dedicated reporting system specifically for crew security interaction incidents, creating a direct channel where pilots and flight attendants could report stops or detentions or questioning that seemed inappropriate or discriminatory, and the system ensured that every report went directly to a point person in the legal department who had authority to investigate and escalate as necessary. The airline also released a public statement that was widely described in industry publications as one of the more substantive corporate accountability statements seen in the aviation sector in years. And what made it substantive was that it admitted specific failures rather than offering vague commitments to values. It acknowledged that previous informal complaints had not been properly investigated, admitted that the airline's reporting systems had not adequately protected crew members from discriminatory treatment, and committed to specific measurable changes that would be implemented on defined timelines. The ripple effects extended far beyond Meridian Airport and Transatlantic Airways as other airports and airlines began examining their own policies and training in light of the national attention this case had received. Within 6 months, 47 airports nationwide had adopted similar protocols for crew interaction and body camera review. The FAA had issued new guidance on preventing interference with airline crew members during pre-flight operations. The Department of Transportation had updated its civil rights training to include this case as a case study, and 3 other airport police departments had launched internal reviews after their own officers were reported for similar patterns of stops that seemed to target black crew members disproportionately. Garrett Sullivan's participation in the Restorative Justice Program, began in the first month after his resignation from the Meridian Airport Police Department, and his initial approach was marked by defensiveness and resistance and a determination to get through the required sessions with minimal emotional engagement or personal examination. The program facilitator, a woman named Dr. Sharon Martinez, who had 23 years of experience in restorative justice practices, recognized immediately that Sullivan was treating this as a box-checking exercise that he needed to complete to avoid federal prosecution, and she made clear in their very first session that surface-level compliance wouldn't be sufficient, and that the program required genuine engagement with what he had done and why he had done it. "I want you to watch your body camera footage," Dr. Martinez said during that first session, pulling up the recording on her laptop. "But this time, I don't want you to watch yourself. I want you to watch Captain Cole. Watch her face, watch her body language, watch how she responds to you, and then tell me what you see. Tell me what—" Sullivan had seen the footage before, had watched it dozens of times in the weeks after his resignation, but he had always watched it with his attention focused on his own actions, mentally constructing defenses and explanations for each decision he had made. Watching it again with Dr. Martinez's instruction to focus on Vanessa changed what he saw, forced him to notice details he had been avoiding, the way her jaw tightened when he asked where she thought she was going, dressed like that, the careful control in her voice when she explained she was going to her aircraft, the micro-expression of hurt that flashed across her face when he used the word impersonating in his radio call, the way she checked her watch not with impatience but with visible calculation of what this delay would cost. "What do you see?" Dr. Martinez asked when the recording ended. "I see a woman in uniform," Sullivan said, falling back on the same defensive formulation he had used with his wife. "What else?" Sullivan struggled with the question, because answering it honestly would require acknowledging things he had spent his entire adult life avoiding. "I see someone who's trying really hard not to show that she's upset," he finally said the words, coming slowly and reluctantly. "Why do you think she had to hide being upset?" Dr. Martinez pressed. Sullivan started to answer, then stopped, then started again because he knew the answer and he hated knowing it. Because if she had shown anger or frustration, I would have used it against her. I would have said she was being uncooperative or aggressive or difficult, and I would have made the stop last even longer. That acknowledgement, spoken aloud for the first time, felt like something breaking inside him, like a crack appearing in the wall of rationalizations he had built to avoid examining his own biases. "Doctor." Martinez didn't congratulate him or move on quickly to softer topics. She sat with that admission for a long moment and then asked, "How many white pilots have you stopped for credential verification?" Sullivan tried to think of examples, tried to remember times when he had questioned white crew members the way he had questioned Captain Cole, and the fact that he couldn't recall any specific instances told him everything he needed to know about the pattern he had been following without ever consciously choosing to follow it. "I don't remember stopping any," he admitted. "So when you say you were just doing your job, what job were you actually doing?" Dr. Martinez asked, and the question hung in the air without any easy answers, because the job he had actually been doing was not security verification, but rather enforcement of assumptions about who belonged in positions of authority and who didn't. The second month of the program involved group sessions with other officers who were participating in restorative justice processes for their own cases of biased policing, and listening to their stories and rationalizations forced Sullivan to recognize patterns he had been part of without seeing them clearly. One officer talked about how he consistently pulled over expensive cars in certain neighborhoods because expensive cars didn't belong in those areas and must indicate drug dealing or theft, never examining the assumption that black people who could afford nice cars must have obtained them illegally. Another officer described stopping teenagers for loitering in places where white teenagers hung out all the time without being questioned, explaining that he had been trying to prevent gang activity, but never considering that his definition of suspicious behavior was racially coded. The stories varied in their specifics but shared common elements. assumptions that operated beneath conscious awareness patterns that officers defended as professional judgment, even when data showed those patterns targeted people of color disproportionately, and an unwillingness to examine whether their instincts might be leading them wrong, because examining that possibility would require admitting that they had been causing harm while believing they were doing good. In the third month, Dr. Martinez gave Sullivan an assignment that he initially resisted. She told him to write a letter to Captain Vanessa Cole, not to send, but to write as an exercise in articulating what he had done and what harm it had caused and what he understood now that he hadn't understood then. Sullivan stared at a blank page for hours, starting sentences and deleting them, writing apologies that felt hollow even as he typed them, trying to find words that would capture something true about what he had done without making excuses or minimizing the damage. Finally, after several false starts, he wrote, "Dear Captain Cole, I stopped you that morning in the terminal because when I looked at you, I didn't see a captain. I saw a black woman wearing a captain's uniform, and those two things didn't match up in my head with what I thought a captain should be. I saw your credentials, and I still didn't believe them because the credentials didn't match the picture I was carrying around of who gets to be in charge of an airplane full of people. I made you stand in that corridor and defend your right to do your job, made you prove something you had already proven by having the training and the license and the uniform and the perfect record. I delayed your flight and inconvenienced nearly 200 passengers because my assumptions mattered more to me than your documentation. I told myself I was following protocol, but the truth is I was following bias, following patterns I had never examined or questioned, because examining them would have meant admitting that I was the problem, not you. I'm not asking for forgiveness because I don't deserve it and I don't expect it. I'm just saying that I see it now. I see what I did, and I see why I did it, and I see the harm it caused. And I'm going to spend whatever time I have left making sure I never do anything like that to anyone ever again." He sealed the letter in an envelope and kept it in his desk drawer, taking it out sometimes to remind himself of who he had been and who he was trying not to be anymore. And the letter became a kind of anchor point for the work he was doing in the restorative justice program, a written record of acknowledgement that he could return to when defensiveness or rationalization started creeping back into his thinking. By the fourth month, Sullivan had taken a job at the community college in facilities management, quiet, unglamorous work that involved maintaining buildings and coordinating repairs and staying mostly invisible to the students and faculty who moved through the campus. And the anonymity of that work felt appropriate somehow, a recognition that he had forfeited any right to authority or public trust. But he also began volunteering for the college's community outreach program, helping to run conflict de-escalation workshops for at-risk youth in the area, using his own mistakes as teaching examples in ways that were uncomfortable but felt necessary. He told groups of teenagers about the detention, showed them the viral video, walked them through his flawed decision-making, and explained how bias had operated beneath his conscious awareness. And he ended these sessions by telling them directly, "Don't be me. Don't let your assumptions about people override what you can see with your own eyes. Don't convince yourself that you're being professional, when what you're actually being is prejudiced." In the fifth month, Sullivan did something that surprised even himself. He contacted Wings of Hope, the nonprofit aviation program, where Captain Cole volunteered as a mentor, and asked if they needed volunteer ground support help. He made clear that he wasn't asking to teach or mentor or interact with students directly, wasn't presuming that he had earned the right to any kind of visible role, but just wanted to know if there were equipment or facilities, tasks that needed doing unglamorous behind-the-scenes work, that would support the program without putting him in a position where his presence might make participants uncomfortable. The program director, a woman named Angela Foster, who knew exactly who Sullivan was and what he had done, was skeptical about his motives and his suitability. But after consultation with her board and with Captain Cole herself, she decided to allow him to volunteer on a trial basis, doing exactly the kind of invisible work he had described. So Sullivan started showing up at the Wings of Hope hangar on Saturday mornings at 6 a.m., arriving before the young student pilots came for their lessons, carrying equipment and setting up flight simulators and cleaning aircraft and doing maintenance work on the grounds. And he kept his head down and didn't talk much and tried to make himself useful without being intrusive. The young black girls who came for lessons sometimes recognized him from the viral video, and one 11-year-old named Isabella approached him one Saturday morning and said with the directness that children have before they learn to soften uncomfortable truths, "You're that cop who stopped Captain Cole." Sullivan felt his stomach drop, because he had been dreading exactly this kind of confrontation this moment, when he would have to face someone from the community he had harmed and try to explain himself, knowing that no explanation would be adequate. He said quietly, not defending or explaining, just acknowledging the fact. "I'm not a police officer anymore." "Are you here to stop us?" Isabella asked the question, carrying genuine concern rather than hostility. "No," Sullivan said, meeting her eyes directly because she deserved that much honesty. "I'm here to help you fly, to help with whatever you need so you can learn to fly and become pilots if that's what you want to be." Isabella studied him for a long moment, and then she nodded and went to her lesson, and Sullivan went back to his equipment work. And that small exchange felt like something important, even though nothing dramatic had happened, even though there had been no grand apology or reconciliation, just an acknowledgement of past harm and a tentative step toward making amends through action rather than words. 6 months after the detention that had changed both their lives, Captain Vanessa Cole stood on a small stage at the Wings of Hope annual fundraiser gala, looking out at a ballroom full of donors and supporters and young women who had earned their pilot's licenses through the program. And she spoke about what the organization meant to her, and why she had dedicated so much of her time and energy to making sure that black girls who dreamed of flying would have pathways to make those dreams real. The gala was being held at an aviation museum surrounded by historic aircraft and photographs of pioneering pilots, and Vanessa's keynote speech was scheduled as the centerpiece of the evening, the moment when the program's mission and impact would be articulated most clearly for potential donors and community partners. Sullivan was sitting in the back row of the ballroom, uncomfortable in the dress shirt and tie he had worn because the program director had asked him to stay for the event after he finished his usual Saturday setup work, and he had almost declined because he knew Vanessa would be speaking, and he wasn't sure he had any right to be in the same room with her, let alone at an event celebrating work she had pioneered. But Angela Foster had been direct in her invitation, telling him that he was part of the program now, whether he was comfortable with that or not, and that hiding away wouldn't serve anyone's healing or growth. So Sullivan had stayed and now sat in the back, trying to make himself as invisible as possible. Vanessa saw him immediately when she took the stage, her eyes scanning the audience and landing on his face for just a brief moment, and Sullivan half stood ready to leave if she wanted him gone, ready to respect whatever boundary she needed to maintain. But Vanessa gave a slight shake of her head, "Stay," and Sullivan sat back down, his heart pounding in a way that had nothing to do with the formal setting and everything to do with the person on stage who had every reason to want him as far away as possible. Vanessa's speech began with stories about the young women the program had helped, girls who had started out believing that flying was something other people did. People who didn't look like them or come from their neighborhoods, and who had learned through Wings of Hope that the cockpit was available to anyone willing to work hard enough to earn a place there. She talked about her own journey from that 10-year-old girl at the fence in Detroit to the captain she had become, and she talked about the obstacles she had faced along the way, the assumptions and barriers and moments of doubt that had threatened to derail her path, but that she had navigated through a combination of skill and determination and stubborn refusal to accept anyone else's limitations on her possibilities. And then she talked about the incident, though she didn't name Sullivan or go into unnecessary detail, just acknowledged what had happened and what it had represented. 6 months ago, she said, her voice carrying clearly through the ballroom's sound system. I stood in a corridor at Meridian International Airport while someone questioned whether I belonged in this uniform. They looked at my credentials and decided those credentials couldn't possibly be real because they didn't match the assumptions that person carried about what a captain should look like. But here's what I learned from that experience, and here's what I want every young woman in this room to understand. Your belonging is not up for debate. You don't need permission from people who can't see past their own assumptions. You earn your place through training and certification and skill, and once you've earned it, it's yours. The sky doesn't check your credentials at the door because the sky only cares about one thing: whether you know how to fly. The audience erupted in standing ovation, and Sullivan stood with them because not standing would have been conspicuous, and he watched Vanessa acknowledge the applause with grace and composure, and that same professional bearing she had maintained throughout the detention, and he felt the full weight of what he had tried to take from her, the dignity and authority and hard-earned place in a profession that she had spent her entire life working to reach. After the speech, there was a reception where donors mingled with program participants and staff, and Sullivan stayed in the back near the exit, watching from a distance as Vanessa talked with young pilots and signed autographs and posed for photographs with girls who looked at her with expressions that mixed hero worship and determination. He was preparing to leave quietly when he saw her walking toward him, cutting through the crowd with purpose, and his first instinct was to apologize, to try to explain himself again, to somehow make her understand that he had changed and was still changing. But when she reached him, all of those words evaporated, and he just stood there waiting for whatever she wanted to say. "Mr. Sullivan?" she said, her tone neutral and professional, neither warm nor hostile. "Captain Cole." He managed his voice rougher than he intended. "I was just leaving. I didn't mean to intrude on your event. The director tells me you've been volunteering?" Vanessa said, neither approving nor disapproving, just stating a fact. 5 months now. Equipment setup, maintenance work. "Yes, ma'am," Sullivan said, falling back on formal address because he had no idea what else to say. "Just ground support, trying to help where I can." "Why?" The question was direct and not unkind, genuinely asking rather than challenging. Sullivan took a breath because he knew that whatever he said next would matter, would reveal whether the work he had been doing in the restorative justice program had actually changed anything fundamental, or whether he was still the same person hiding behind different words. "Because I need to," he said finally. "Because those girls deserve better than what I gave you. Because I spent 8 years in a uniform making assumptions about who belonged in professional spaces, and I need to spend whatever time I have left trying to undo some of that damage." Vanessa studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable, and Sullivan didn't try to fill the silence or plead his case further, just let her take whatever time she needed to decide how to respond. "I wrote you a letter," he added, the words coming out before he could stop them. "Never sent it. But I wanted you to know that I see it now. I see what I did, and I see who I was, and I'm trying to be different." "Good," Vanessa said simply, and the single word carried more weight than any elaborate acceptance speech could have. "Keep trying." She extended her hand, and Sullivan looked at it for a moment before understanding what she was offering. Not friendship or forgiveness, those would have been inappropriate and premature, but acknowledgement, recognition that he was doing the work, and that the work mattered, even if it couldn't undo what had already happened. He shook her hand, feeling the firm, professional grip of someone who had spent years commanding respect in environments that tried to deny it to her. "Thank you, Captain," he said, his voice catching slightly. Vanessa nodded and walked away back to the young pilots who were waiting to talk with her, and Sullivan stood there for a moment processing what had just happened. Not forgiveness, not absolution, but something that felt like the smallest possible beginning of repair, the acknowledgement that transformation was possible, even if redemption remained uncertain. 1 year after Officer Garrett Sullivan stopped Captain Vanessa Cole in the corridor of Meridian International Airport, The ripples from that 22-minute encounter continued spreading outward in ways that neither of them could have fully anticipated, touching lives and changing systems and creating consequences that would extend far beyond the immediate parties involved. For Vanessa, the year had been exhausting and rewarding. In almost equal measure, she was still flying her regular routes for transatlantic airways, still maintaining the same professional standards and perfect safety record she had always held. But she had also become something she had never sought to be, which was a public figure and advocate whose story carried weight in conversations about bias and credentialing, and who gets assumed to belong in positions of authority. She had been asked to consult with 15 different airlines on their diversity initiatives, had given a TEDx talk titled "The Gap Between Credentials and Perception" that had been viewed over 4 million times, had published an article in Aviation Week titled "Who Belongs in the Cockpit? Everyone Who Earns It," and had received the NAACP Image Award for her advocacy work in promoting equity in the aviation profession. But despite all those public recognitions and professional achievements, what meant most to Vanessa were the quieter moments, the encounters that happened in terminals and hotel lobbies and airport crew lounges, when other black pilots or flight attendants approached her to say thank you, to tell her that her willingness to document what happened and demand accountability had given them courage to report their own experiences with discrimination, had made them feel less alone in navigating a profession that still looked at them with surprise or skepticism, despite their obvious qualifications. A young black woman flight attendant with Transatlantic pulled her aside in the Atlanta crew lounge one morning and said with emotion in her voice, "You're the reason I applied for this job. I saw that video, and I saw you keep your composure and keep your dignity and still fly that plane. And I thought, if she can do that, then maybe I can do this." And Vanessa hugged her and felt something loosen in her chest. Some of the accumulated weight of the past year easing slightly, because this was why she had written that 16-page complaint instead of just letting it go, why she had participated in training programs and interviews and consultations, even when she was exhausted, because every person who felt empowered to pursue aviation because of what she had survived made the cost of that survival feel slightly more worthwhile. For Zoe Bennett, the 9-year-old girl who had watched the detention through the terminal glass and declared that she would become a pilot, the year had brought her closer to that goal in ways that would have seemed impossible before that March morning. She was now 10 years old and had logged 12 hours in flight simulators through the Wings of Hope. Junior program had become the top student in her age group and had written a school essay titled "The Day I Decided to Fly" that had won the county writing competition and had been read aloud in classes throughout her district. The essay described watching Captain Cole get stopped and questioned, described Zoe's confusion and her grandmother's explanation, and the realization that sometimes being right and having credentials and doing everything correctly still wasn't enough to protect you from other people's assumptions. And the essay ended with Zoe's declaration that she would become a pilot anyway, that she would claim her place in the sky regardless of who tried to tell her she didn't belong there. Vanessa had attended the award ceremony for Zoe's essay as a surprise guest arranged by Patricia Bennett, and when Zoe saw her walk into the school auditorium, the young girl's face had lit up with pure joy, and she had run across the stage to hug Vanessa with the unself-conscious enthusiasm of a child who hadn't yet learned to be reserved with her heroes. "You came," Zoe had said, her voice muffled against Vanessa's uniform, and Vanessa had knelt down and said quietly, "I wouldn't miss seeing you receive this award. Future Captain Bennett." And Zoe had beamed and held on to that moment like a treasure, evidence that the path she had chosen was real and achievable, and that the woman who had inspired her believed she could actually walk it. For Sullivan, the year had been a journey of slow, uncomfortable transformation that had no clear endpoint and no guarantee that the work he was doing would ever be sufficient to repair the damage he had caused. He was still working at the community college in facilities management, still volunteering every Saturday morning at Wings of Hope, doing the invisible work of equipment maintenance and facility upkeep. And he had completed the restorative justice program, and had begun speaking at police academies around the state using his body camera footage and his own story as a cautionary tale about how bias operates beneath conscious awareness and how unchecked assumptions can destroy careers and harm innocent people. The talks were difficult every single time, required him to stand in front of rooms full of police recruits and show them the worst version of himself and explain in detail how he had failed, and the questions he received afterward were often hostile or skeptical young officers who couldn't imagine making the same mistakes and who resented being told they needed to examine their own biases. But occasionally someone would approach him after one of these talks and say quietly that they recognized themselves in what he had described, that they had made similar assumptions or had stopped people based on gut feelings, that they now understood might have been bias rather than legitimate security concerns. And those conversations, as uncomfortable as they were, felt like the only meaningful contribution Sullivan could make toward preventing what had happened to Captain Cole from happening to someone else. His daughter Lily, now 13, sometimes attended his talks and told him afterward that she was proud of him for trying to fix what he had broken, and Sullivan would tell her what he told everyone who offered praise for his transparency, that he couldn't fix what he had broken, that the harm was done, and the past couldn't be changed, but that he could try to do better going forward and could try to help other people avoid making the same mistakes. The ripple effects extended throughout the aviation industry and law enforcement communities in ways that would have been impossible to predict from that single morning encounter. 47 airports had adopted new protocols for crew interaction based on the recommendations that came out of the Meridian investigation, and those protocol changes had resulted in a 68% reduction in crew detention incidents nationwide in the first year of implementation. The FAA had made implicit bias training mandatory for all airport security personnel, and the Department of Transportation's Civil Rights Division had begun using this case as a model in their training programs on how to recognize and address discriminatory enforcement patterns. 3 other airport police departments had launched internal investigations after their own officers were reported for similar patterns of disproportionately stopping black crew members, and 2 of those investigations had resulted in officer terminations and policy reforms. Wings of Hope had received over 12,000 applications in the past year, a more than tenfold increase from their previous annual application numbers, and they had expanded their programs to accommodate the surge in interest, adding new training facilities and hiring additional instructors, and creating partnerships with airlines that would provide direct pathways from the program to professional flying positions. Most significantly, 89 black women had earned commercial pilot licenses in the past year compared to 34 in the previous year, and while that increase couldn't be attributed solely to Vanessa's story and the national conversation it had sparked, program directors and industry analysts agreed that the visibility of a black woman captain standing with dignity in the face of unjust questioning had inspired young women who might otherwise have believed that flying was something people like them didn't do. 18 months after the morning that changed everything, Captain Vanessa Cole walked through Meridian International Airport at 6:47 a.m. The exact time and the exact path she had walked on that Tuesday in March, when Officer Garrett Sullivan had stepped into her path and questioned whether she belonged in the uniform she was wearing. She moved through the terminal with the same purposeful stride she had always carried her flight bag rolling behind her, her crew credential visible around her neck, her 4 gold captain stripes catching the early morning fluorescent light. And this time no one stopped her. No one questioned her. No one looked at her with skepticism or doubt, or the assumption that she must be wearing someone else's clothes. She passed the corridor between gates B12 and B14, the exact spot where Sullivan had blocked her way, and she felt nothing dramatic or traumatic about passing through that space, felt only the quiet acknowledgement that this was where something significant had happened, and that she had survived it and moved forward and used it to create change that mattered. A young black woman in a transatlantic airways uniform approached Vanessa near the coffee kiosk. Her first officer stripes 3 gold bars, indicating that she was relatively new to commercial aviation, and the woman stopped with an expression that mixed nervousness and determination and said, "Captain Cole, I'm First Officer Simone Harris. This is my first day flying out of this airport, and I just wanted to say thank you. Your video, your story, the way you handled everything that happened, that's why I finished flight school. I almost quit because I thought maybe I didn't belong. Maybe I was kidding myself thinking I could do this, but then I saw you stand in that corridor and maintain your composure and prove yourself, and then fly your plane anyway, and I thought if she belongs, then so do I." Vanessa felt her throat tighten the way it always did when someone told her that her experience had helped them claim their own space in this profession, and she reached out and squeezed Simone's shoulder and said with absolute conviction, "You do belong, First Officer Harris. You earned your place here, the same way I earned mine through training and skill, and refusing to accept anyone else's limitations on what you can achieve. Welcome to the sky." Simone nodded, her eyes bright with emotion, and then she headed toward her own gate to begin her first day, and Vanessa continued toward Gate B-17, where her own flight, TA-889 to Atlanta, the same route she had been scheduled to fly that morning, 18 months ago, was waiting for her arrival. At the gate, Maya Rodriguez was working the podium, and she looked up as Vanessa approached and smiled with the warmth of someone who had witnessed everything that had happened and who had been part of making sure it didn't end in silence and erasure. "Morning, Captain Maya said. Good to see you." "Good to see you too," Maya Vanessa replied, and the simple exchange carried the weight of shared history and mutual respect, and the understanding that sometimes the most powerful resistance comes from people who refuse to let injustice disappear into the background noise of daily operations. Vanessa boarded her aircraft and settled into the left seat, the captain's chair that had become as familiar to her as her own heartbeat, and she found David Callahan already in the right seat running through the preliminary checklist items. And when he looked up and saw her, his expression softened with the kind of genuine affection that comes from flying together through calm skies and rough weather and everything in between. "You good, Captain?" he asked the question, carrying layers of meaning beyond just whether she was ready for the flight. "I'm good," Vanessa said, her hands finding their positions on the controls. These instruments that knew her and trusted her and responded to her commands with the mathematical certainty of physics and engineering. "Let's fly." The pre-flight checks proceeded smoothly, each item called out and confirmed with the practiced coordination of a crew that had flown together hundreds of times. And when tower clearance came through and the aircraft pushed back from Gate B-17 at 7:46 a.m., exactly on schedule, Vanessa felt the familiar surge of focus that came with the transition from ground operations to flight operations, from the complicated, messy human world of assumptions and biases to the cleaner world of aerodynamics and navigation, where skill mattered more than speculation about who belonged. The taxi to runway 36R was routine. The takeoff was smooth, and as the aircraft lifted off the Charlotte runway and climbed through the morning sky, Vanessa looked out the cockpit window at the city spreading below her, the airport growing smaller, the terminal becoming just one geometric shape among many, and she thought about everything that had happened in the 18 months since Officer Sullivan had stopped her. She thought about Zoe Bennett now logging hours toward her student pilot license and writing essays about claiming space in the sky. She thought about Simone Harris starting her first day, and all the other young black women who had earned their wings because they had seen someone who looked like them refuse to be erased from a profession that had never made space for her. She thought about the 89 new pilots and the 47 airports with changed policies, and the officers going through implicit bias training and learning to recognize when their assumptions might be leading them wrong. She thought about Sullivan carrying equipment at Wings of Hope every Saturday morning, doing the invisible work of trying to repair damage that could never be fully undone, but that could perhaps be partially addressed through consistent effort over time. And she thought about herself, still flying, still mentoring, still showing up in her uniform, because representation wasn't extra work or bonus responsibility, but rather essential labor that created pathways for the people coming behind her. The plane leveled at cruising altitude 37,000 feet above a world that looked peaceful and ordered from this height, even though Vanessa knew it was neither of those things, and David handled the radio communications while Vanessa monitored systems and thought about the next generation of pilots who would sit in this left seat, who would command these aircraft, who would navigate not just the physical challenges of flying, but also the human challenges of belonging in spaces that had historically excluded them. The sky stretched endless in every direction, blue and clear and full of possibility, and Vanessa placed her hands on the yoke and felt the familiar vibration of the aircraft responding to her input, felt the connection between intention and action and result that made flying feel like the purest kind of truth where your credentials spoke for themselves and your skill was the only thing that mattered. Atlanta approach, transatlantic, 889 level at 370, she said into her radio, her voice calm and professional and carrying the authority of someone who had earned every stripe on her shoulders and who belonged exactly where she was. She flew. That corridor at gate B13 is still there unchanged, except for the memories it now carries, and passengers walk through it every day without knowing that this unremarkable space once held a confrontation that would be viewed by over 127 million people worldwide, and would spark conversations about credentials and assumptions, and who gets trusted to hold positions of authority in this country. But sometimes a young girl passes through that corridor and her mother or grandmother tells her what happened there. Tells her about the captain who stood with dignity while someone questioned her right to wear her uniform. And that girl looks at the space with new understanding and thinks about what it means to belong somewhere that doesn't automatically make space for you, what it costs to maintain composure when every instinct screams that the situation is unjust, what it takes to turn a moment of discrimination into a catalyst for change that extends far beyond the immediate harm. The physics of flight don't care about doubt or assumptions or bias. They care only about lift and thrust and drag and weight, about the mathematical certainties that govern how aircraft move through air, about skill and training, and the steady hands that have earned every hour logged in the flight record. Vanessa Cole has 18,200 flight hours now, and every single one of them belongs to her. 47 airports changed their policies because one woman documented everything and demanded accountability instead of accepting that bias was just the cost of doing business in a profession that had never been designed to include her. Sullivan changed his life because he was given a choice between transformation and prosecution, and chose the harder path of actually examining his assumptions instead of just removing himself from the situation where those assumptions had caused harm. Zoe Bennett will earn her private pilot's license at age 16, the same age Vanessa dreamed of flying, and she will do it because she saw someone who looked like her refuse to be diminished by other people's limitations. The viral video has been viewed 127 million times, but the number that matters more than any view count is 89. The black women who earned commercial pilot licenses this year because they saw someone who looked like them refused to accept that she didn't belong because they understood that credentials and skill and determination could overcome assumptions and stereotypes and the accumulated weight of a system that had never expected them to succeed. Vanessa still mentors at Wings of Hope every chance she gets, still answers late-night texts from nervous student pilots who are doubting themselves or facing obstacles that seem insurmountable, still shows up in her captain's uniform to career fairs and school visits because representation isn't optional or extra, but essential to building a profession that reflects the full range of people who are capable of flying if given the chance. She flies because she earned it through 2 decades of training and certification and perfect performance. She fights because others deserve the same opportunities she had to claim. And every time a young black girl watches a plane take off and thinks, "I could do that," Vanessa's work continues, not in a corridor where someone questioned her credentials, not in investigations or policy reforms or viral videos, but in the sky, where credentials speak for themselves and where she belongs completely. 4 gold stripes and all.